if she could sit with Amy. Amy was surprised by how much they had in common, and soon they were enjoying lunch together every time Janet was in the office. Sometimes they ate in the dining room, and other times they went out. The two young women chatted about the usual topics for people in their 20s. Most of their conversations revolved around clothes, friends, their husbands, and their past experiences. One day, Janet nudged Amy and playfully whispered about a guy they both noticed. Amy blushed but then laughed, responding, "Yeah, he's quite the catch." After that day, they felt more comfortable with each other and shared stories about their college days and life before marriage. Amy discovered that Janet was quite adventurous, while Janet found out that Amy had a fun-loving side. About 2 months later, Janet came into the lunchroom with exciting news. Clara, Mr. Harriman's administrative assistant, had taken a job elsewhere, and Mr. Harriman had offered Janet her position. She beamed at Amy as she shared the news. "Isn't that fantastic? I've been waiting for this opportunity for so long." Amy smiled at her friend and said, "I'm so happy for you. I know how much you wanted this job, but I'm really going to miss our lunches together. You'll be so busy now." Janet chuckled and replied, "Oh, you'll see me more than you think. Mr. Harriman has allowed me to invite you to interview for the job as my assistant. Do you want it?" "Oh my gosh, yes. I would love to be your assistant. Do you think he'll get it?" Amy asked, excitement bubbling in her voice. That night, Amy could hardly sleep, and the next morning she arrived at work very early. She wore her best work dress and worried that she might not look professional enough to impress Mr. Harriman. As soon as he arrived, he asked for Amy to come to his office. When she walked in, he studied her for a moment and said, "Well, Amy, Janet has told me great things about you. This interview feels more like a formality, but I still need to learn a bit more about you before offering you the position. I want to see how you interact with senior team members and discuss some job details with you." With that, Mr. Harriman walked around his desk and took a seat beside Amy. He placed his hand on her leg and leaned in closer. Looking her in the eye, he asked, "You know this job involves a lot of late hours and travel, right? There might be times when you'll spend more time with me in a day than with your husband. Will that be a problem?" Amy tensed a little when she felt his hand on her leg, but she didn't pull away. She wanted this promotion so much that she didn't want to upset Mr. Harriman. After thinking for a moment, she replied, "No, Mr. Harriman. That won't be an issue for me. I can explain it to my husband." Mr. Harriman kept his hand on her leg as he continued asking her questions. Most of them felt like they were just filling time. While talking, he lightly moved his fingers in small circles on her thigh, and Amy felt herself getting a bit nervous. She couldn't help but shift a little in her seat as she focused on the conversation. Eventually, Mr. Harriman decided to end the interview and stood up. Amy sat there, feeling a mix of excitement and anticipation. As he walked away, he made a point to squeeze her shoulder gently. "Well, Amy, I think you will fit in just fine. If Janet gives you the thumbs up, I'm on board," he said. They both looked at Janet, who nodded in agreement. Mr. Harriman gave her a quick pat on the shoulder before heading back to his seat. Overcome with joy, Amy jumped up and hugged Mr. Harriman. "Thank you, Mr. Harriman, thank you so much," she exclaimed. Flushing with happiness, she stepped back and added, "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that. I'm just so excited." Mr. Harriman smiled and replied, "That's perfectly okay, Amy. Since we'll be working closely together, you can call me Howard now. Why don't you go with Janet? She'll give you all the details about your new job and get the paperwork sorted out." Amy was thrilled about her new position and couldn't wait to share the news with her husband, Jeffrey. She loved the new salary, which was nearly double her previous income, along with the added benefits that came with the job. The initial training was straightforward and easy. Janet first showed Amy the paperwork for her new job, but it was nothing she hadn't seen before. As a marketing assistant, she had already handled much of that work. The main new tasks were arranging business meetings and entertaining customers and vendors. During their early conversations about the job, Amy sometimes felt young and inexperienced. She chuckled to herself about it. After all, she was only 26. She was surprised to learn that they sometimes held outings for their customers and suppliers, especially to places she hadn't expected. After 6 months in her new role, Janet asked Amy to assist with a dinner meeting the following night. This would be the first meeting she would attend, even though she had helped set up several for Janet. When Amy arrived at the restaurant, she was led to a private room where special meetings took place. She figured this was so they could discuss business without interruptions. Inside the room, there was a table with 6 chairs. Janet was already there and greeted Amy with a warm smile and a gentle kiss on the cheek. "There's a bar in the corner. Help yourself, then come sit with me for a moment, Amy. I want to go over the protocol before Howard and our guests arrive." Amy poured herself a glass of wine and sat beside Janet. She was taken aback by how stylish Janet looked in her fancy dress. It was elegant yet simple. After sitting down, Amy felt a bit startled but quickly got comfortable. Once they were settled, Janet smiled and asked, "So, Amy, how do you feel about the office part of your new role? Are you enjoying it? Are you ready to learn the more important social aspects of the job?" Amy replied, "Oh yes, I really enjoy working with you and Howard. It feels good to meet all the influential people. I feel like I'm making a real difference for the company. I've always dreamed of being in a high-powered environment, but I'm not quite sure what you mean by the social aspect." Janet explained, "Well, Amy, part of our job is to organize evening events for some of our most valued customers and suppliers. Also, from time to time, we travel with Howard for conferences and presentations. One of the most important parts of our job is to organize these meetings and be a friendly face during them. Most of the time, we provide our own entertainment instead of hiring outside help, because we like to enjoy ourselves while working. We do everything we can to make sure everyone is happy, no matter what it takes. Do you understand?" Amy was a bit unsure when she answered. Well, I'm not entirely clear on things. I understand I need to set up the meetings, arrange the entertainment, food, and places to stay. I'm just a little confused about the social side of the job." Janet laughed lightly as she replied, "Don't worry about that. You're a young, lively, and clever woman. From our conversations before the interview, I knew you would do well in that area. Tonight, all you need to do is watch and help out if someone needs a drink or something. You'll make sure you get home at a good hour. We can discuss everything more on Monday." Amy and Janet chatted for a few more moments until Howard came in with 3 other men. They clearly seemed to have been having a good time before arriving at the restaurant. Janet and Amy stood and walked over to greet them near the table. Amy remembered seeing all 3 men earlier that day at the office. She was surprised when they all gave Janet hugs and friendly kisses when they met her. It caught her off guard when Janet allowed them to be a bit playful before sending them into Howard's office with a laugh. Amy remembered hearing a lot of laughter and chatter coming from the office earlier that day. Twice, Janet had been called inside and stayed for more than half an hour both times. Each time, when she returned to the outer office, she seemed a bit flustered, with her hair and clothes not quite in place. Amy found it hard to believe that Janet was doing what it seemed she was doing, but felt too shy to ask. Now, seeing how Janet was dressed, Amy wondered if Janet was being unfaithful to her husband. They had only been married for a little over 2 years, and she couldn't imagine Janet doing something like that. As Amy and Janet approached Howard and the 3 men, he reached out and put his arm around Amy, pulling her close. He introduced her by saying, "This is Janet's assistant, Amy. She won't be with us for the whole evening. She's new in this role and still learning. We hope to have her ready for your next visit." We were still teaching her the job, and she needed to get back home to her husband today in good shape. Amy was surprised by the laughter that followed, but decided it was just their odd sense of humor. Once the men were seated, Amy and Janet stayed busy taking notes, giving them copies of the contracts they were discussing, and serving drinks. The men wanted them to sit at the table with them whenever they could. Amy and Janet sat with a guest on either side while Howard was across the table. After finishing the business talks, Amy had a few drinks with the men. Finally, Howard said it was time to eat, and Amy told the waiter to serve the meal. Throughout the nice meal, the man next to Amy kept trying to get too close. She gently pushed him away several times and was planning to tell him to stop. But when she turned to face him, she was shocked by what she saw. Janet was leaning in close to the man beside her. Amy watched in surprise as the man next to her touched Janet's arm and seemed to be enjoying her company. Janet smiled and seemed to welcome his attention. Amy felt speechless as she noticed the relaxed atmosphere at the table, with laughter and playful exchanges. Howard looked at Amy and smiled, then said, "It seems Janet is having fun right now. Could you please get everyone more drinks? Unless you want to stay longer, I think you should head home. I believe Janet can manage the rest of the evening." That first evening stuck in Amy's mind for a long time. She left the meeting feeling strange and confused. When she got home, her husband Jeffrey noticed her mood and asked if everything was okay. She didn't want to share what was on her mind, but replied, "Oh, honey, after the business part of the meal, Howard, Janet, and the customers wanted to relax a little. Howard said he and Janet could handle things, so I decided to come home. Some of Janet's actions surprised and worried me. It's nothing you should concern yourself with. I'm sure I'll sort it out on Monday." All weekend, Amy found herself worrying about what Janet might say or do around her husband. By Monday morning, she still didn't have any answers. Janet's bright smile and cheerful hello on Monday made Amy think again. She couldn't understand how Janet could have acted so normal after what happened on Friday evening. When Amy entered the office, Janet noticed her quiet good morning and looked at her with concern. "Amy, what's wrong?" she asked. Amy fidgeted and avoided making eye contact as she responded. "Nothing, Janet. It's just, how could you do that to Danny? I mean, you let those men..." Janet burst into her usual warm laughter, relaxing back in her chair. "Oh, Amy, you're too much. I didn't do anything to Danny. I just did my job and had a lot of fun while doing it. Danny has no idea what happens in our meetings and dinners, and I hope he never finds out, but I didn't harm him at all. I remember you mentioning how free you were before getting married. You talked about loving the excitement of dating different people. Well, as my assistant, you could find a bit of that excitement again and still earn good money." Amy looked shocked as Janet continued. "What you saw last night was just me having a good time while we hosted some important visitors. If I can enjoy myself while we do our work, what's the issue? It didn't hurt anyone. In fact, we both gain from my little adventures. I feel energized afterward, and it makes things more exciting at home with Danny. I'm sure you'll feel the same way next time. Besides, studies show many people in relationships have been unfaithful. If other people do it, why shouldn't I have a little fun too?" Amy shook her head and said, "I could never do that to Jeffrey. I just couldn't." Janet laughed. "Come on, are you telling me you didn't go home feeling excited? I bet you had a great weekend with Jeffrey, didn't you?" Amy blushed and turned away. Janet pressed further. "Didn't you?" Finally, Amy looked at Janet, her cheeks red. She nodded and whispered, "Yes, but I couldn't do what you did." Janet just smiled. "Really? Remember when you shared your fun stories from your bachelorette party? If you could enjoy yourself then, you can now. It's even safer to explore at our meetings because no one will tell Jeffrey. But it's totally your choice. It's just an extra perk of our job. We get to connect with some interesting people. Men who are willing to spend money for fun and know how to treat a woman well. Just focus on your work and I'll handle mine and everything will be fine. If I made a mistake about you, tell me, and you can return to your previous job. Just promise me you won't tell Danny that I let my guard down in the meetings." Amy almost shouted when she replied, "Oh no, please. I don't want to go back to my old job. I really like this position and want to move up in the company. I need the higher salary. I'll do my best to keep our customers happy." Amy felt bad about promising Janet to help her with something she knew was wrong. She really wanted the better job and was willing to do a lot to keep it. She had always admired successful men and wanted to be around them. Amy promised to stay quiet about what happened during their meetings and to fully support Janet. Amy didn't see Janet smile after their talk ended and she went back to her desk. Janet picked up her phone and called Howard. It was a bit uncertain for a moment, but I think she's fully committed now. I had to remind her of some past choices to convince her, but I think she's ready for the next step. Later, after the morning break, Howard entered the office and stopped at Janet's desk. Janet and Amy looked up when he said, "You both did great on Friday night. Amy, all three of the men thought you were fantastic and knew your stuff. They are looking forward to having you in the next negotiation session when they come back." Howard then turned to Janet and added, "Thanks to you, we got the signatures we needed early this morning. Here is the bonus you earned last night for your help. I'm sorry it's only $10,000 this time, but the contract was only for a year with options to renew. Do you have any plans for this bonus? or will you save it like the others?" Janet smiled and replied, "What do you think? It always goes into savings. Why change now?" After Howard left, Amy sat quietly and stared at Janet as she looked at the cash. She had never seen that much money in one place before. "What? I mean, you got $10,000. Janet laughed and said, "Amy, don't overthink it. If someone does something outstanding in their job, they should get a bonus, right? Well, Howard thinks I played an important role in securing that contract, a contract that brings in more money than usual, I should add. Why shouldn't he give me a bonus for that? And there is more to it than just that." She chuckled again and winked at Amy. 3 weeks later, Amy was put in charge of organizing the next meeting. On a Tuesday morning, Amy was informed that a meeting was scheduled for 4 men the following Thursday in a town more than 1,200 miles away. She was tasked with organizing the hotel rooms, meeting space, meals, and drinks. That Tuesday evening, before their flight on Wednesday, her friend Janet suggested that Amy bring something less formal than business attire to wear at the meeting. Janet also mentioned, "If you think you'll be back to your room too late Thursday, or if you'll be busy, you might want to tell Jeffrey that the cell service isn't good at the hotel. You have to step outside to get a decent signal." The next morning, as Amy was about to leave, she remembered Janet's advice. Jeffrey was getting into his car too, so she called out to him. "Oh, Jeffrey, I almost forgot. Janet told me the hotel we're staying at in Sacramento has really bad cell service inside. If you can't reach me, just leave a message or call the hotel." Feeling a bit relieved, Amy backed out of the garage with a small smile. Jeffrey had never asked which hotel she was staying at. On the day of the meeting, Amy was so nervous she could barely think straight. Once the meeting room was ready, Janet noticed and took her to the bar for a drink. "Have this, Amy. You look really tense. This is just a business meeting and a bit of fun. Don't worry too much. We have 4 important men and Howard to entertain, and we want you to feel comfortable." After the meal, as the dishes were cleared away and conversations flowed more easily, Amy started to relax. She and Janet were busy serving drinks. At first, Amy tried to stay a little distant, but as the night went on, she found herself enjoying the lively atmosphere. Once she returned to her seat between 2 businessmen she had been chatting with, she turned to one of them to check if he needed anything. Just then, she noticed Janet with the 2 men she had been speaking to earlier, and her eyes widened in surprise. The businessman beside her noticed her reaction and smiled. "Well," he said, "looks like we need to get with the program, don't it, Amy?" After he said that, he leaned toward her for a kiss. Amy was so horny, she leaned toward him and returned the kiss. When the man she was first kissing broke the kiss, the man on her left pulled her toward him and began kissing her. Amy moaned again. Before she knew it, she was having her first orgasm. Janet came right after she did. Amy opened her eyes and turned toward him when she heard Howard say, "What say we adjourn this meeting to more comfortable surroundings?" All 4 men said that was a great idea, so they all 7 straightened their clothes for the walk through the lobby to the elevators. The elevator doors weren't fully closed when Amy felt her top being pushed below her breasts. When the elevator door started to open, Amy tried to pull her top up. Each woman stopped at the door to her room. Howard opened them and grandly gestured the lovers into their rooms. He followed Amy and her men into her room, and then opened the door connecting the 2 rooms. After this second orgasm, Amy's night degenerated into a "thankfully the girls got some more sleep on the flight home, so they didn't look too bad when their husbands picked them up at the airport." Howard smiled and shook each man's hand as he said, "You guys ought to be proud of these 2. I don't think I would have gotten the contract signed without them, and I am positive we wouldn't have got as good a price without their help. Now take them home and let them know how much you've missed them this week." He turned to Janet and Amy and said, "I'll see you in the office Monday, you 2. Amy couldn't look Jeffrey in the eyes that entire evening. She was so scared he could tell she had taken a lover she was sick. When Jeffrey asked her what she had done during the evening, she said, "Oh, we had supper with the customers and visited a while, then I went back to my room." While she was saying that, Amy got sick at her stomach and ran into the bathroom and threw up. Jeffrey was worried about her and followed her into the bathroom. "Honey, are you okay?" he asked. Amy was crying and throwing up. Between heaves, she said, "Yeah, My stomach has been upset since lunch. We had some greasy Mediterranean food, and it and the spices have gotten to me. I'm really tired. I think I'll go to bed now. On Monday morning, Amy and Janet were sitting talking during the morning break when Howard once again came into the outer office. He smiled at both girls and passed out the bonuses. They were once again in cash. Janet got $15,000 and Amy got $10,000. The weeks progressed and Amy was called on to travel 1 or 2 times a month. More and more often, Amy had to work late, and she occasionally had Saturday meetings. She didn't get a bonus for every meeting, but whenever the meeting resulted in an income stream for the company, she did. Jeffrey was getting angry and complaining about her hours. Jeffrey was getting upset about her working hours. About 3 months after the first meeting Amy arranged, Janet arrived at work one morning looking very troubled. She had been crying on and off all morning. Just before lunch, Janet told Amy she might be late because she had a doctor's visit. However, Janet never returned to work that day. The next morning, Janet showed up looking like she hadn't slept at all. As soon as Howard entered, Janet gave Amy a small smile and walked into Howard's office. They were in there for more than half an hour. When she finally came out, Janet appeared to have been crying again and looked very pale. She turned to Amy and said, "Howard wants to see you." When Amy entered Howard's office, he pointed to a chair and said, "Close the door." After sitting down, Howard looked at her for a moment before leaning back in his chair. He laced his fingers together and rested his hands on his stomach. Howard sighed and said, "Amy, Janet is going to take a new job next month. I know you were hoping to learn from her for another year before her promotion, but things have changed, and she will be leaving sooner. I need to ask you if you want her job as my administrative assistant. There will be many late nights and trips involved. Do you think Jeffrey will cause any issues? You will likely be working about 1/3 more hours and traveling than you do now, even with the assistant we will need to find for you." Amy was shocked by Janet's sudden departure and excited about the new position. The salary would be double what she was currently making, and the bonuses would be much larger. She had only been an assistant for about a year and already had around $100,000 saved in bonus money. She had wanted to tell Jeffrey about it when she first started receiving it, but struggled to find a good way to explain since it was cash. Because it was underthiedable money, she hadn't reported it for tax purposes either. After a few meetings, she began to think that if Jeffrey ever found out about her earnings, she might need that extra money for when he, let's be honest, when he divorced her. Because of this, Amy had built quite a secret stash, and the new position would allow her to save even more. Janet's bonuses were often higher than what she received for each meeting they attended together. Once Amy and Howard finalized the details of the transition, Amy walked back into the outer office. Janet's eyes were red, and she held a damp tissue in her hand. Amy put her arm around Janet and asked, "What's wrong, Janet? Is there anything I can do to help?" Janet shook her head and whispered, "I'm pregnant. Danny and I have been planning to start a family, but I'm not sure if it's his." "Oh, Amy, I think I conceived during that first meeting you set up. I forgot to take my pill until it was too late. I didn't remember until the next morning, and I couldn't get the morning after pill. I tried to tell myself everything would be okay, but now I wasn't so sure. The timing doesn't fit for this to be Danny's child. I feel lost about what to do. If I choose to end the pregnancy, I worry Danny will find out. But if I don't, he might notice the baby isn't his. What will I do?" That night, Amy went home early. She was excited to tell Jeffrey about her promotion. But when she did, he didn't seem happy at all. He asked, "Is there any way you can back out? I hate that you're gone so much, and I don't want you to be gone even more. Why don't you just quit or switch jobs?" Amy was upset and raised her voice. "It's fine for you to have late meetings and work over 50 hours a week, but I can't? My job matters to me just as much as yours does to you. I'm meeting important people who can help us move forward in life. Plus, you'll be earning the same as you now, and I have responsibilities too. Just because I'm working late and traveling doesn't mean I care any less. If you can't be happy for me, just deal with it. If all goes well, in a couple of years, you'll have a job that requires much less travel and late nights. Then we can enjoy our life together again." The following weeks were tense, but Jeffrey eventually began to accept Amy's job and hours. What still bothered him was their relationship. Amy sometimes got home late 1 or 2 nights a week, but he adjusted. However, the weekend meetings were harder for him to understand. Once a month, Amy would have to stay overnight for a meeting or leave early Sunday to get to one. He couldn't understand why it had to be that way, and he didn't feel satisfied with her answers. After 6 months in her job, Amy came home looking upset. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and she had a wet handkerchief in her hand. Jeffrey immediately went to her and asked, "Amy, what's wrong?" She wrapped her arms around him tightly and said, "I had a drink after work with Janet, and she told me Danny is divorcing her. You know, she got pregnant and found a less demanding job when I got my promotion. They had the baby, but it was a shock to Danny. When he saw the baby, he yelled at Janet and walked out. She hasn't seen him since. He didn't help her home, and when she returned, the locks were changed. Now she's been served with divorce papers and he won't talk to her." Jeffrey looked at Amy and asked, "How did she get pregnant? I mean, what happened? Was she unfaithful?" "The few times I met her and went out with her and Danny, I thought she was very in love with Danny. I can't believe she even found time to be unfaithful if she was as busy as you are." Jeff's eyes widened, and he suddenly shouted, "Those work trips and late nights! She was being unfaithful to Danny, wasn't she? Why did you stay with her? Jeff stopped speaking and looked at Amy in disbelief. Amy felt her face turn pale, then red as she looked into her husband's eyes. What she saw there frightened her. Her stomach tightened and her knees started to wobble. Tears began to fall as Jeff asked, "Have you been unfaithful at those meetings?" Amy pleaded, "No. Many have shown interest, but no, I never." Jeff interrupted her, saying, "You better not have been. I've been worried for months that something was wrong with this. Now I think I understand. If I ever find out you were unfaithful to me, it's over. You'll be out the door just like the agreement says." He turned away and walked into the living room while Amy watched him leave, crying. The next morning, a Thursday, Amy opened the door to the garage and called to Jeff. "I'll be late again tonight, honey. We have another late presentation on the Stover proposal." After telling her husband, she hurried out, hoping to get in her car before he replied or caught up with her. Amy sighed as she shut the door without hearing any comment from Jeff. As she drove to work, Amy wished she could reduce her late nights and weekends before Jeff became too upset and did something rash. She loved Jeff deeply, or at least she thought she still did. Her new job took up a lot of her time and energy, leaving her little time to spend with him. The demands of her work also meant she had less opportunity to give him the attention he needed. In fact, being in her new role had made her feel quite content in that area, and the extra money was a nice bonus. She thought that if she played her cards right, one of the important men she worked with could help both her and Jeff find better jobs. Amy knew she only had about another year, maybe a little more, in her role before her boss would look for another assistant. Janet, the woman she replaced, had made it clear that clients often tired of the same person, and she needed to work hard for as long as she could. Normally, Howard kept an assistant for about 2 years. If she did well in her job as Howard's assistant, she could find another good position within the company, or he would help her find a similar or even better job elsewhere. After she left her job as his administrative assistant, if she stayed with the company, she'd only be asked a few times a year to help the new assistant with projects. Occasionally, a salesman or customer might want to see her. Janet had mentioned that over the years, this happened less and less. Staff changed, and people didn't know the past assistants, or they preferred the new, younger ones. Amy thought about her job and the money she and Jeffrey were making. She wished he would find a better job. If she could just convince one of her contacts to offer him a good position, things might improve. If he earned more, she might not have taken the job as Janet's secretary, or at least she wouldn't have kept it after finding out about the social side of the role. She was worried Jeff would discover what she was doing, but she wanted to make more money and live a comfortable life so much that she was willing to take the risk. Amy chuckled to herself and admitted that much of the time, being around the executives and salesmen was exciting. She got a thrill from her secret life and sometimes met some interesting people. She also hoped to use her connections to find better-paying jobs for both herself and Jeffrey. She sighed. Jeffrey was a business analyst with an MBA from a top school, yet he was only earning $64,000 a year working for a small company in his hometown. Sometimes she puzzled over what a feed and farm supply store needed with business analysis. She had tried many times to persuade him to look for a better job, but he always said no. When Amy got home, she found a note from Jeff. He wrote that he needed to go to Steelville to consult with the management of the feed and farm supply store. He figured that since it was the middle of the week, she wouldn't take off from her job, so he just left. His note continued, "Since I'll be home for the meeting, I think I'll visit my parents for a few days. I should be back early next week. If you need me, just call my cell or Mom and Dad. He'll probably stay with them or at the resort." Amy felt her jaw tighten in frustration. She couldn't understand why he liked that small town. It only had about 1,000 people, and the nearest town with a larger population was 25 miles away. That was why she had wanted to work in Springville, where there was more to do, even though they didn't go out often. Even before she took her new job, Jeff didn't want to go out much. She had to persuade him to join the country club, and even then, he hardly ever went. It was hard to believe a grown businessman only played golf when he had to. Why he preferred fishing and hunting was hard for her to understand. She wished they could have lived in a bigger town, but Jeff only wanted to stay 70 miles from his home. Jeff hadn't told anyone he was coming back, so when he pulled into his parents' driveway, he wasn't surprised to find them gone. He guessed they were either out for dinner or visiting relatives. Since it was nearby, he decided to stop by his grandfather Fielding's house first and struck gold. The whole family was outside on the patio having a gathering. As he walked around the corner, his sister spotted him first and shouted, "Jeff, what brought you back from the city?" She ran to him and wrapped him in a big hug. The rest of the family quickly followed, all happy to see him. After catching up, Jeff asked what the gathering was for. When he learned it was to celebrate his sister's baby's second birthday, he felt embarrassed for forgetting. Jeff eased into a chair with a sigh and gratefully accepted a glass of Glenlivet from his grandfather. He held out his glass for a refill as he felt himself relax. Amid the sounds of children laughing and playing, he could also hear the gentle flow of a nearby stream making its way to the swimming hole. Now and then, Jeffrey noticed his grandmother Anne watching him. Once, he saw her whispering to his mother, father, and grandfather Jim. As the gathering began to wind down, everyone left except for Jeffrey, his grandparents, and his parents. They all pulled up chairs and faced him. His grandmother spoke for them when she said, "All right, son, spill it. You show up in the middle of the week without your wife, and you look like something's bothering you. Now what's going on in Springville?" Jeff sat in surprise, realizing he was that easy to read. He opened his mouth but then closed it again. After taking a deep breath, he finally said, "I'm not sure if there's a problem, but sometimes I feel like Amy." "Just say it. What about Amy?" his grandmother urged. "Is she unhappy? Is she leaving? I can see something's not right. I've seen that look before." The other adults exchanged glances, and his grandmother turned a bit red. He remembered that she and grandfather Jim had divorced a little over 4 years ago, and then remarried after losing their second spouses in an accident. He wondered if her previous marriage troubles were similar. Jeff sighed and shook his head. "I just don't know," he said. "I can't find proof, but I can't shake my doubts. She worked for the administrative assistant at Harriman for a few months. She had to dress up more, but sometimes her style seemed more about impressing someone than doing her job. She had to stay late at work several nights a month and also had to go on overnight trips a few times. After those nights, she would avoid being close to me. She did everything she could to steer clear of me, even when it meant starting arguments. You know, when the admin assistant took another job, she got to be in charge of her new team. She's away from home at least one night a week, coming back late, and once or twice a month she needs to be gone for a few days with Mr. Harriman. Most of these trips start or finish on weekends. Amy won't talk about her job and refuses to quit. She keeps saying she just needs to stick it out for a year or two, then she can apply for a less busy job and will probably get it. She acts like there won't be much competition. I've looked into it, and nearly all Mr. Harriman's admin assistants stay for 2 years after being in the assistant role for about 1 to 2 years. All his assistants are young, mostly in their 20s, and married. It seems he prefers married assistants. I didn't find any who were single applying for the job. I'm sure some would have been a good fit, maybe even better than a married woman since they might travel more freely. Some admin assistants don't last long in the job because many leave after their 6-month trial period. Those who make it past that time usually become Mr. Harriman's admin assistant. All the admin assistants either got jobs that paid the same or more if they stayed with the company or found similar paying jobs elsewhere. Additionally, I discovered that 3 of the assistants' marriages ended in divorce because they faced issues during business meetings and trips. Amy only worked as an admin assistant secretary for about a year because her boss had to leave for personal reasons. About 6 months later, her former boss had a child and her husband filed for divorce. The child's father was different from her husband. Considering how many meetings and trips they had, it seemed like her boss might have gotten pregnant while working. Based on Amy's schedule, she probably had only about 3 nights at home each week with her husband, and if she was like Amy, she likely felt exhausted those nights. When Amy shared about her old boss, I regretfully spoke without thinking. I let my feelings of frustration with Amy and her hectic schedule slip out. I asked, "What happened? You know what I mean? How did it all go down? Was she unfaithful or what?" The few times I met her and went out with her and Danny, I thought she was really in love with him. Then when I looked at Amy's face, a thought crossed my mind and I said it out loud. Those business trips and late nights. She was seeing someone else, wasn't she? You were with her a lot. Why did you let that happen? I remember the surprise I felt as the realization hit me. Amy turned pale, then flushed red as she looked at me. She seemed scared and started to cry when I said that. I asked her, "Have you been seeing someone else at those meetings?" She insisted she hadn't, but admitted that others had shown interest in her. I told her, "You better not be cheating. I've been worried for months about something being wrong. If I find out you've been unfaithful, it's over. You'll leave just like our agreement states." Then I walked away, leaving her in tears. Earlier this morning, Amy yelled from down the hall that she had another meeting to work on an account. I understand it's her job, but I don't see why Howard needs 2 women there at every meeting unless something else is going on. I came home partly to see if you would allow an investigation into Howard and Amy. Of course, I wanted to see you all too. I'll cover the investigation costs, but I need your permission to change Homer's work. The older Fieldings leaned back in their chairs after Jeff finished. Finally, his father Paul said, "Son, something seems off about all this, but I can't figure out what it is. From what you've told us about Amy before, this isn't out of character for her. We were concerned when she didn't want to move to a smaller city than Springville. But that was your choice, so we stayed quiet." Paul turned to his father and said, "Dad, I think we should support Jeff on this. Let's get Homer and Jeff together tomorrow and see what they can find out." Paul then asked, "It's getting late. Jen, are you ready to go home?" He looked at Jeff and asked, "Are you coming to our house or staying here?" Jeff sat for a minute and said, "If there's a cabin open, I think I want to go to the lodge. I might do some fishing while I sort through this. Call me on my cell when you have the meeting set up with Homer, please." Jim went inside and got the key for the resort office. He handed it to Jeff and said, "This is the key to the resort front door, and this one is for my office. The cabin keys are in the center desk drawer. Use the honeymoon cabin, son." I know this is not an easy time for you, but the honeymoon cabin is the best and most private one. It's also close to the best places for swimming and fishing. We don't have it booked for the next few days, so you can use it as long as you want. Would you like to have breakfast with us here, in town, or at the resort? Jeff thought for a moment and said, "I'm not really hungry for breakfast right now. I guess I'll find something later if that's okay." By the time Jeff drove the 3 miles to the resort, got the key, and unloaded his bags, it was almost 3 a.m. He just got ready for bed without unpacking or showering. The next thing he knew, he heard a woman's voice say, "Mr. Fielding, are you still in here? This is Abigail. Your father tried to call you, and when you didn't answer your cell, he called the office. He says your meeting is set for lunch. You need to be in the cafe by 12:30 if that's okay." Hearing footsteps approaching his room, Jeff quickly grabbed a sheet to cover himself. He looked up to see a lovely woman walk through the door. He noticed her blush and thought she must have seen him before he got fully covered. He said, "I'm sorry, Abigail. I wasn't expecting anyone and, well, you caught me off guard." Abigail let out a light laugh and replied, "That's all right. I'm sorry for coming in like this, but I knocked and didn't hear anyone. I was checking to see if you were here or out fishing. Your father said you might be on the river." She looked at him shyly and added, "Besides, I grew up with two brothers. I'm used to seeing this." Abby smiled and said, "It's 10:30 now. Do you want me to find you some breakfast, or would you rather wait for lunch?" Jeff smiled back and replied, "No breakfast needed, but if you have some coffee, I would really appreciate it." Abby smiled at him and said, "We do have fresh coffee. Would you like me to bring some down, or would you prefer to have it with me in the dining room?" "He'll come up. See you in a few. And thank you, Abigail." Jeff got to the cafe about 10 minutes early and found his father, grandfather, and a man he was introduced to as Homer Scroggins already there. They shook hands and chatted a bit while ordering. Then Jeff's father, Paul, said, "Son, I've shared what you told us last night with Homer. Why don't you repeat it for him and then tell us everything you know about Harriman's business? If you prefer, we can go back to the resort before discussing personal matters with Homer." For the next 30 minutes, Jeff talked to Homer about how Amy had been behaving and how much time she spent working late and traveling for her business. He shared what little he knew about former administrative assistants and their secretaries. Jeff was surprised he didn't know more about Harriman's business and promised to change that when he got home. All he really knew was that they printed various business forms. He researched companies and looked at their reports. It might be a bit harder since Harriman wasn't publicly listed, but he could still find useful information. He promised to gather what he could and share it with Homer within a week. Once they returned to the resort, Jeff invited Homer into his cabin and offered him a drink. Homer replied, "No thanks, not now, but if you want one, help yourself. I recorded our chat at the cafe and I'd like to record this one too. Is that okay?" Jeff sighed but said, "Sure, go ahead." Then Homer asked, "All right, Mr. Fielding. Please tell me everything you can about your wife Amy, her job, responsibilities, her friends and clubs, and anything unusual you've noticed in the past few months. Don't leave out anything, even if it seems small." Jeff took a deep breath and began, "Well, Homer, I met Amy during my last semester in college. She was set to finish her bachelor's degree in May, and I was completing my master's around the same time. I was the teaching assistant for a business class she was in. She was captivating, quick-witted, and always had a big group of friends around her. I was drawn to her, but I tried to keep my distance at first since I felt that was the right thing to do. I'm still not sure if she really struggled with the coursework or if she was just pretending, but she often came to me for help. Initially, we met at the library, but soon we would go to a nearby cafe after our study sessions to continue talking or just unwind with a drink. Before long, we started dating. I was captivated by so many things about her. Amy was caring and kind. We shared similar tastes in food and movies. We had alike views on politics and social issues. We enjoyed dancing and having fun together. As we grew closer, she started going out with her friends less often, and soon we were spending nearly every evening together. By Valentine's Day, I was deeply in love with her, and after a special dinner, I asked her to marry me. She said yes, and we set the date for June 13th, right after graduation. Everything went well. Her family liked me, and I liked them too. The only concern seemed to be my family. For some reason, they were not as taken with Amy as I was. They all told me she was clever, charming, and smart, but my grandmother especially warned me to be careful with her. She didn't think she was the best match for me. When I told everyone I was going to marry her, they put aside their concerns and helped us out. I wasn't sure if I didn't tell Amy about my plans after graduation, or if she just ignored me. But when I finally told her I planned to work for the family business and move back, she got upset. She said she didn't want to stay in this small town and that I should reconsider my career choices. Amy had worked hard to get out of the town where she grew up, and she didn't want to get stuck in another one. This led to our first serious argument and nearly broke us apart. Eventually, I suggested a compromise. I would work for the firm, but we could live in Springville. She wasn't thrilled because Springville felt too small to her, but she seemed to accept it. After we settled in Springville and she found her first job, the old, cheerful Amy came back. We had a great time together. She would sometimes go out with friends, but usually wanted me to take her to dances and social events almost every weekend. She insisted we join the country club to meet the right people and build connections. As a year passed, she began to hint that we needed to earn more and find better jobs. She said we had met enough people and that I should look for a higher-paying, more responsible job with bigger companies in Springville, or even in a different city. I have been living off the salary from our business along with what Amy made. We are saving money, but she wanted more. Amy has always dreamed of living a luxurious life, going to fancy resorts, and enjoying world travel. Big cities excite her. She loves the nightlife and mingling with people she sees as wealthy. I realize now that I didn't make it clear that I would prefer to spend my free time fishing and hanging out with friends and family. Sometimes, I worry that her desire for excitement is leading her in a different direction. When she became Janet's secretary after about 6 weeks, she started wearing nicer, more trendy clothes. 6 months later, her whole wardrobe had changed. While the outfits were still suitable for work, they pushed the boundaries of what was considered appropriate. Her skirts became shorter and her tops were thinner. I asked her about this and told her it looked like she was seeking attention from men at work. This made her very angry, and we didn't speak for several days before things went back to normal. Before Amy was promoted to administrative assistant secretary, we were intimate about 4 to 6 times a week. After she became Janet's assistant, the time they spent together dropped to 2 or 3 times a week. Now that she works for Howard, I am lucky if we have any time together each week. She seems to avoid me, especially when she returns late from work. On those nights, she says she is too tired and needs to unwind. This is even more noticeable after her longer trips. Homer sat thinking about the notes he had written down. He asked some questions to clarify certain things. Finally, he said, "Okay, Jeff, with the addresses and signed papers you gave me at the cafe, I think I can get started. If I need anything else, I have your number." Jeff tried to relax, but all he could think about was Amy and their struggles. On Sunday afternoon, he decided to go back home. Before leaving Steelville, Jeff called Amy to tell her he was on his way back. His family didn't want him to leave so soon, but they understood. The closer he got to home, the more anxious he felt. When he pulled into his driveway, he noticed a strange car parked in front of the garage near Amy's side. Jeff opened the door and drove into the garage. He walked into the house with his luggage and saw Amy's boss, Howard, sitting in the living room. Amy was not in sight. When Howard saw Jeff, he stood up and said, "Jeffy, we need to talk. Just leave your luggage there and come in here for a few minutes. We need to clear some things up before I let Amy fill you in." Jeff felt a surge of anger. Not only did this man call him Jeffy, but he was also trying to boss him around in his own home. He stepped into the living room and faced Howard. "I don't appreciate being called Jeffy, Howie, and I especially don't want to be ordered around in my own house. I suggest you leave before I decide to show you the door." Howard laughed and settled back down. He replied, "You can try to throw me out, but I doubt you're strong enough. If you don't change your attitude, you'll find it very difficult. Now sit down and let me finish telling you how things will be from now on. Your attitude has upset Amy, and because of that, she made a mistake on a very important contract for me this past Friday. I lost a deal worth several $100,000 because she couldn't focus on the negotiations. I had 3 unhappy visitors this weekend, and it's your fault. I'm telling you to back off Amy and let her do her job. She is one of the best assistants I've ever had, and her skills in negotiations are unmatched. Your complaints and demands are messing up her ability to concentrate, and I won't allow that to continue. You have a minor role for a small company and think you are in charge here. Well, let me tell you something. I'm in a powerful position, and I won't let you disrupt my work. When Amy comes in, you need to listen to her and be supportive, or you will regret it." After that, Howard stood up and looked at Jeffrey with a sneer before he walked out the front door. Jeffrey was still in disbelief when he heard the bedroom door open. He saw Amy quietly enter the room and take a chair across from him. "I'm sorry Howard was so tough on you. I tried to convince him to back off, but he was really upset when he found out why I was bothered last Friday. The last straw was when I was too upset to help with the talks that evening. I asked him to let me talk to you, but he refused." "You know he has a point," Amy continued. "You have a great degree from a top school. You don't need to be working at a small place. Just support me for a year or 2 until I can find a better job. Then we can move to a bigger city where we can earn more money. I'm making connections that can help you get a strong job in a good company." Howard said if you keep pushing, he will ruin you, and he can do it. 4 years ago, a couple of his assistants' husbands did the same thing you're doing. He talked to them like this, but they wouldn't back down. They ended up losing their wives and causing them a lot of stress. He had to find replacements for both his assistant and her secretary at the same time. Their husbands lost everything. They couldn't get reference letters and ended up in low-paying jobs. Oh, Jeff, I don't want that for us. Please just help me with my work. I promise to pay more attention to you. Jeff leaned back in his chair and looked at Amy. I can't believe you just said that. All I ask of you is what we promised each other when we got married. You remember through good times and bad, in wealth and poverty, in sickness and health, to love and cherish each other forever. I meant it. I realize some travel and late hours can happen, but this isn't acceptable. If you haven't already ended our marriage and if you want it to last, we need to make some changes. After saying this, Jeff stood up and took his bags into the bedroom to unpack. He could hear Amy crying while he worked. For the next 3 weeks, things went on the same way. Amy worked late, and when she came home, she kept her distance from Jeff. He would get a quick kiss on the lips or a peck on the cheek, and then she would hurry off for a bath. She went on a long business trip with Howard and her secretary. Jeff was very upset with Amy, and when she tried to be close to him twice, he turned her down. On Friday of the 3rd week, Homer called Jeff at work. Jeffrey, I'm afraid you were right. This is possibly the worst case of dishonesty from a wife I've seen in years. Can you come home this weekend? I need to give you the report and explain everything. Jeffrey sighed and replied, I knew it. Sure, Homer. Amy's away on another long trip, so I was just going to be alone again. She won't be back until sometime on Sunday. How about we meet tomorrow morning at the resort around 10? Jeff didn't bother to contact Amy or leave a note. He knew calling her wouldn't help. She never answered her phone during meetings or trips. He just packed. He only took a few clothes since he worked for the family business and didn't need formal clothes unless there was an important meeting, which he didn't have. He packed one suit, a couple of casual outfits, and plenty of everyday clothes. He also called his parents and grandparents to let them know he was coming. They had his cabin ready for him when he arrived. Grandpa Jim and his father Paul met him at the resort. His father hugged him and said, I'm really sorry, son. Homer wouldn't share details since it's your private matter, but he said it's really serious. Jim looked at Jeffrey and gave him a big hug, whispering, I know what you're facing. I went through something similar years ago. You'll be here after Howard leaves, or if you want, I can sit in with you. Jeff considered this for a moment. He said, I guess this is the end of my marriage. If Howard has what I think he does, I don't care if Amy is embarrassed. If she has been unfaithful, the marriage is over, so seeing her like that doesn't matter to me. You can come if you want. After that, they settled Jeff into his cabin and all returned to the main house for dinner. Later, they sat on Jim's patio with drinks and watched the sunset. Jeff sighed and said, I really miss this place. It was hard for me when Amy wouldn't move back here after college. If I hadn't loved her so much, I might have come home alone, and we wouldn't have married. If things go as I think, I'd like to move our offices back here, if that's okay. Jim looked at Paul and replied, That sounds fine. I can't see anyone having a problem with it. I'll make sure, but you should plan on the move. It would be great to have most of the family around again. Finally, about 11 p.m., Grandmother Ann helped a very drunk Jeffrey back to his cabin and got him settled into bed, sort of. She assisted him inside and sat him down before helping him take off his shoes and pants. After he fell back onto the bed, she covered him with a blanket. The next morning, just after 8, Abigail woke Jeff up again. She knocked on the front door, and when he answered, she came in carrying a pot of fresh coffee. Mr. Fielding, your grandmother asked me to bring this coffee to you. You'll keep it warm on the stove. Would you like me to make you breakfast before your meeting with Mr. Scroggins? Jeff peeked out from the bedroom door and said, Thanks, Abigail. If it's not too much trouble, I'd love some breakfast. What can I choose from? Abigail smiled and replied, I can make a country breakfast with ham, sausage, or bacon, or a Western omelet with what I have here. I can also get pancake ingredients. Just let me know what you prefer. Jeff grinned and said, The Western omelet and hash browns sound perfect. While you're cooking, I'll take a quick shower. After finishing the meal, Abigail went to the bathroom door to let Jeff know it was ready. She knocked but didn't get a reply, so she opened the door a little to tell him. She blushed when she saw him sitting on the toilet, looking at a picture of Amy and crying. The mirror was foggy from his shower, and he was only partly dry. Abigail quickly pulled her head back and called louder, "Mr. Fielding, your breakfast is ready." Jeff jumped and replied in a shaky voice, "Thanks, Abigail. He'll be right there." As Jeff was finishing his breakfast and chatting with Abigail, his father and grandfather arrived. Abigail quickly stacked the dirty dishes in the dishwasher and said, "Oh, I should head back to the office now. I'm sorry for taking so long," and hurried out of the cabin. The three men sat together, sipping coffee and chatting casually until Homer came by around 9:45 a.m. All three stood up, and Jeff opened the door when Homer knocked. After they shook hands, Jeff asked, "Homer, where would you like to sit? We can use the coffee table for documents, or we could go into the dining area." Homer looked thoughtful for a moment and then said, "I think we'd be more comfortable in here. If you want to watch the DVD while I'm here, we can, but I've seen it and suggest taking it to a lawyer without watching it first. Honestly, it's quite intense. My written report would be enough if I were you. Some of our team are still keeping an eye on Mrs. Fielding was at her meeting, which felt just like the others she had been to recently. We managed to get some recordings of her daytime activities, and it seems they are truly working on contracts and business deals during the day. However, after work hours, it appears your wife, her boss, and others involved begin to engage in intimate activities. Often, Mrs. Fielding spends the entire night with their clients. Mr. Harriman is there as well. The next morning, she sleeps in before returning to negotiations at lunch and for the afternoon session. Her assistant is also involved, but not as much during the evening events in Springville. We haven't been able to see what happens during her office meetings. The few dinner meetings at Springville hotels showed no inappropriate behavior. She did have one private meeting in a closed room that we couldn't access. I don't know what happened there, but our operative near the room reported some unusual sounds. He did see her enter a room with two gentlemen and stay for about an hour. She looked composed when she left, but as you know, that proves nothing. After gathering the details and documents from Homer, Jeff thanked him and walked him to the door. When he returned to the living area, he found his father and grandfather looking over the report. At times, one of them would express frustration. Finally, Jim tossed the report onto the table with a sigh. He picked up the DVD packet, studied it, and then handed it to Jeff, saying, "Son, I viewed the images of your grandmother and read all the reports. It's hard to take in. What do you want to do with this?" Holding the DVD packet, Jeff muttered as he moved to the player. While inserting the first DVD, he said, "I don't think I can handle much more, but I need to see it for myself. I understand if you don't want to watch, but I have to see at least the start." Jeff pressed play as his father and grandfather left the cabin. The DVD began with Amy, Mr. Harriman, and a few other men entering a hotel room. Amy was laughing and playfully batting at their hands. Her blouse was already open, and she seemed to be enjoying their attention. The camera focused in, and there was a mark on her shoulder. The date on the DVD showed this was filmed the week after the surveillance was approved. Once the door closed, Amy turned and embraced an older man, and they shared a long kiss. For about 5 minutes, Amy stood in the center of a circle of men, kissing and letting them fondle her. Howard had not undressed. He said, "My room is just through that door," and pointed to the connecting door. "If you need anything, just let me know. I'll see you at the meeting tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Howard walked through the connecting door and pulled it partly closed. The men pushed Amy back to the bed, and she fell backwards on it. The older man was definitely in charge. The other three deferred to him and didn't approach Amy until he had chosen his position. Jeff was trembling while he watched Amy get ganged. After Amy relaxed, the silver-headed man pulled his head back and grinned. He said, "Damn, Amy. Doesn't that husband of yours take care of you at all? I think you're hotter than you were last month when we were in Springville." Jeff observed as Amy spent time with the men, and it became clear that they had developed a close and intense connection, sharing quiet moments and lingering conversations throughout the evening. Their actions spoke of trust and camaraderie as they leaned on each other in comfort and familiarity. After some time, Amy was left alone, visibly tired from the night. She took a moment to collect herself, then went to the adjoining room to find Howard, who was waiting quietly. They shared a few words before she moved to rest. Amy didn't say a word. She simply moved closer to Jeff, shared a quiet moment with him, and then returned to her room, where she lay down and quickly drifted off to sleep. Jeff sat in silence for a while before he stood, put the DVD back in its envelope, and filed it away with several others. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, then walked out to the porch of the cabin. There, he was surprised to find his grandfather sitting and waiting for him. Jeff felt a bit embarrassed, noticing the unshed tears glistening on his cheeks. Jim rose, put a comforting arm around his grandson, and spoke gently. "Son, I know what you're going through. I went through something similar a long time ago, and trying to forget it with a drink didn't work. So, go ahead. Have a drink if you need it, but then talk it out and let it go. Do what you have to do, and then move forward." Looking at his grandfather, Jeff said, "I need a good divorce attorney. I might also need someone for legal advice. I'm not going to let this go unpunished. This man came into my life and turned everything upside down. He's going to be held responsible." Jim listened thoughtfully, then asked, "Do you know any of these men involved?" Jeff shook his head and replied, "I only know Amy's boss. I have some first names, but I haven't watched any more of the recordings. From what I can tell, it seems like she only got involved with clients. None of these people seem connected to us or the business, as far as I can tell." Jim nodded and said, "All right, son. Let me handle this. I might be able to deal with him in a way that doesn't even involve direct confrontation. You focus on the divorce, and he'll start looking into her boss and his friends." Jim then took out his phone and made a call. "Homer, it's Jim Fielding again. I've got another job for you. Look up the information you gathered for Jeff and find out the names of those other men. When you do, gather all the details you can: addresses, workplaces, anything. We want to make sure they understand that there are consequences." After a moment's pause, Jim made another call. "Steve," he said, "this is Jim Fielding. I know it's the weekend, but you spend all of Saturday just resting. How about coming out to the resort to chat with my grandson and me? He really needs a good lawyer for his divorce, and I know you do great work. Oh, and bring her along, too. I'll have Ann make sure you both have plenty to eat and drink. We're in the honeymoon cabin. See you in about an hour." After the 2 phone calls, Jim turned to Jeff and said, "Let's sit on the back deck where we can watch the river while we wait for Steve. He's semi-retired now, but he did a great job for me. Once we're done dealing with those people, they'll regret messing with our family." Jim and Jeff were still on the deck when they heard a car pull up. Before they could move, a distinguished older man walked around the cabin and spotted them. He glanced at the bottle on the table and said, "Wow, you didn't even wait for me before starting. Pour me a drink, and then let's get going. I have my recorder ready so I don't miss anything. When you start, you'll turn it on to catch the whole conversation." While they poured Steve a drink and settled down, they heard a car leave. Jim started to go check it out, but Steve stopped him. "Relax. That's just Jolene heading over to your place. I told her to go there if I wasn't back soon. Now give me that drink, and let's get to business. I want to finish so we can enjoy some drinks." Jim explained the situation, and Jeff added the details. Once they had finished, Steve leaned back in his chair and placed his hands under his chin. He seemed to think for a moment before asking, "So, what do you really want out of this, Jeff? We can go all out and take a hard approach, or we can choose a quieter, easier method. I know you're upset right now, but think carefully before we proceed. Sometimes revenge can lead to more trouble." Jim opened his mouth to reply, but Jeff spoke first. "I have a solid prenuptial agreement with Amy. I want to follow it exactly. If either of us is unfaithful, that person leaves the marriage with only what they brought in. Anything we gain after that belongs to the innocent party. If we both have been unfaithful, we leave with what we each contributed plus half of what we built together. I haven't been unfaithful, so I want everything. You have a copy of that agreement. Your partner made it for me just before the wedding while you were away." Jeff smiled and leaned back in his chair. He took a sip of his drink and said, "You know, that prenuptial agreement might be the best thing Amy ever did for me. I was so in love with her that I would have married her without one. She insisted on it because she told me about family members who had cheated and ended up divorced. She believed that the person who got hurt deserved some protection. Plus, she didn't want to end up living an unclear life if things went wrong. I can't wait to turn the tables on her. After all the time she has looked down on our family business and our home, I think she deserves a reality check. I'm pretty sure she never really understood how big our operation is, or that we are worth millions. She thinks we only run a small resort and a feed store in a quiet town. It doesn't help that we never pay dividends but reinvest everything back into the business. I remember a couple of times when I bought or sold shares, she mocked me, saying I was just playing with worthless paper. When Jeff stopped talking, Steve said excitedly, "Do we have a copy of the prenuptial agreement? Did we really draft it for you?" He laughed and added, "If Solange created a prenuptial for you, it has real strength, especially if it says what you claim. I'll check the files when we finish here." "When do you want this to happen? Would you like to talk to her first and see if there's a way to fix things?" Jeff thought for a moment and replied, "The sooner the better. I don't plan on going back to the house except to pick up my personal things and a few pieces of furniture to make living here easier. Grandpa has already said I can use this cabin for as long as I need it. The company has included it as part of my benefits. If you need to reach me, call my cell first and then here. He'll set up an answering machine as soon as I get it from my place in town in case you call while I'm out. By the way, when do you think you can serve her? I'd really like to get my things before word spreads." Steve thought for a moment and said, "If I find the prenuptial in the office, I could have the paperwork ready by Monday. He'll file it with the court Monday evening or Tuesday morning. Then it will just be a matter of having someone serve Amy in Springville. That could probably happen Tuesday afternoon or Wednesday." Jeff smiled and said, "Sounds good. He'll wait until she's at work on Tuesday before I start taking things out of the house. I don't want to give away my plans too early. I'd like for the papers to be served before Wednesday noon if possible, because she often flies out for meetings on Wednesday afternoons." I wanted her to understand that I was getting a divorce, and it was hard for me to face her boss again. The last time I saw him, he made threats when I found him in my house. I didn't want to get into a fight and risk going to jail. Steve looked surprised and raised his voice. "What? You didn't tell me he threatened you when you mentioned he spoke to you about Amy. What did he say?" Jeff replied, "I don't remember everything. He basically said he would ruin me and force me out of town if I didn't leave Amy alone. He claimed he had powerful friends to help him. He also hinted that he could be violent if he wanted to. I don't recall the details clearly now." Steve looked serious and said, "Before you go home, you should buy a small recorder. Keep it with you all the time. If you talk to Amy, her boss, or anyone involved in this, you need to record those talks. We might find something helpful. He'll ask Homer to keep an eye on Amy, your house, and her work." Jeff stayed in Steelville until early Tuesday morning, then took a 1-ton truck back home. A cousin accompanied him to help load it. Things didn't go as planned. Amy stormed into the house shortly after 4:30 p.m., just as Jeff was still packing. His cousin was in the backyard, so Amy didn't see him. When Amy saw Jeff carrying a box, she stepped in front of him crying, "Jeff, how could you do this? I told you my job is just as important as yours, and now you want a divorce. And what's this about you taking everything? I worked hard for those things, and I'll make sure I get my share." Jeff looked at her, feeling frustrated. "Amy, I'm just following the prenuptial agreement that you wanted us to sign. If you don't believe me, get your copy and read it. Actually, I'm being fair. I'm not taking all the furniture. You can have whatever I leave behind. Otherwise, I'll sell it with the house." Amy was angry. "We'll see about that. You messed up, mister." Jeff watched as she stepped aside to make a phone call. He heard her say, "Howard, I just got home and found Jeff loading a truck. He insists on the prenuptial agreement he wanted me to sign. I guess we have to take action now." "Okay, I won't do anything yet. But hurry." Amy sat on the front porch, watching Jeff load the truck. Just as he was about to go behind the house for another load, Howard's car suddenly screeched into the driveway. Howard jumped out of the car and hurried over to Jeff, yelling angrily. Howard shouted, "You little punk! I warned you not to mess with me. You've upset Amy, and it's messing with my business. You better have a lot of money because I'm going to hire a good lawyer. We're going to break that agreement and take everything you own. When I'm done, you'll be lucky to have anything left. No one crosses me or my business, and you just did. You'll pay for this. I know people in this town who owe me favors, and we will make you look so bad that even your own parents won't want you around. I told you if you couldn't handle Amy's success, just get a divorce and leave quietly. But you had to act tough, didn't you? You've really messed up this time. I'm going to teach you a lesson, and then you're going to unload that truck and get out of here." As Howard swung at Jeff, he ducked, grabbed Howard's arm, and threw him over his shoulder. There was a popping sound, and Jeff worried about how much damage he might have caused. Before letting Howard go, Jeff kicked him twice. Just then, he noticed his cousin Joe filming everything. They had brought the camera just in case something like this happened, and they were glad they did. After leaving Howard on the ground, Jeff went back to the backyard for more items. When he returned, he saw Amy helping Howard to his car. She looked at Jeff, visibly upset, and said, "How could you do that?" She helped Howard into his car, and they drove away, likely to a hospital. Jeff and Joe finished loading the truck and were almost at the end of the street when a police car pulled them over. Two officers approached, keeping their hands near their belts as they asked Jeff and Joe to step out of the vehicle. The officers searched them and then handcuffed them. The lead officer read their rights, saying, "You are under arrest for assault and other charges." At the police station, the officers took their camera and other belongings. Jeff realized he had left the recorder in his jacket pocket inside the truck. Since it was after hours, he made his one phone call to his father. When he told his story, he thought his father might get very upset. The next morning, Jeff and Joe got to see their lawyer, Steve, as soon as he arrived from Steelville. Steve smiled when he saw them and said, "Can't you two stay out of trouble? Now tell me what happened so we can help you. They have scheduled your first hearing for 11 o'clock this morning." At the hearing, Steve explained to the judge that there was a divorce happening, and Jeff was just taking some of his personal things from the house. He also said that since Jeff owned the house, there could be no theft. The judge considered this, but the prosecutor added, "Your Honor, there is a court order keeping Mr. Fielding 500 feet away from Amy Fielding, her home, and her job. Mr. Fielding broke that order. His disagreement with Mr. Harriman was because of that, and because he wasn't supposed to take things from the house until the divorce was finalized." Steve turned to Jeff and asked, "Why didn't you tell me about the court order?" Jeff replied, "I've never seen a court order or been told about one. This is the first time I found out she had one. Your Honor, my client says he has never received a court order and wasn't aware of it. It seems odd to me that Miss Fielding got her divorce papers at 3:37 that afternoon, returned home at 4:30, yet had time to see a lawyer for a court order and have it filed and served before her husband started taking his things that morning. Could I see this court order and proof that it was served?" The prosecutor looked uneasy and started shuffling his papers when the judge asked for a copy. He said, "Your Honor, I don't have a copy with me. When I spoke to Mr. Harriman, he assured me that one was valid and that he would provide me with a copy. Let me check with my office." He made a phone call and then turned to the judge. "My assistant is bringing the order to me right now. Can we continue while we wait for it?" The judge pursed his lips and nodded. "Please do." "Yes, sir." "Thank you, Your Honor. Now regarding the assault charge. Mr. Fielding saw Mr. Harriman coming towards him in his yard, trying to stop him from taking more of Miss Fielding's belongings. He dropped the box he was carrying, and then got into an argument with Mr. Harriman, which caused injuries. I have a sworn statement from Mr. Harriman, and reports from the hospital, and the officer who spoke with him and Mrs. Fielding. Jeff leaned over to Steve and said, "That's not true at all. I recorded what you told me to, and Joe made a DVD of everything. Unless they took it, the recorder is in my coat pocket in the truck, and the police have the camera with our things." Steve responded to Jeff, "Good. That should help. And if the investigator on Amy got some good pictures, we can connect this to them easily." He then stood and said, "Your Honor, my client insists that he did not attack Mr. Harriman. He firmly states that he was just protecting himself from Mr. Harriman's actions. He has a recording and a DVD that will prove this. Also, a private detective was following Miss Fielding at that time. He should have pictures and a report to support my client's claims." The judge sighed and asked, "Where are these pieces of evidence?" "Your Honor, the police have the camera with the belongings of both Mr. Fielding and Mr. Harriman. The tape is in their vehicle in a coat pocket. We haven't gotten the investigator's report yet. If we can pause until we can get these items, I believe we can clear this up and let everyone move on." The judge looked at his watch and said, "It's almost noon. Court is adjourned until 1:30 for lunch and to gather more evidence. I hope this will give you both enough time to obtain the items you should have had when this hearing started." Jeff and Joe were taken back to their holding cell. Steve called the investigators to speed up the receipt of the report from the day before, and then went to the police office to get the camera. When he arrived, he received the camera, but when he tried to play it, he found there was no DVD inside. Arguing with the property officer didn't help. The officer insisted that what Steve had was all that was taken into care. Oddly, the inventory listed the camera, but didn't mention a recording disc. Steve then went to the impound yard. He arrived just as an officer was opening the door of a truck. He approached the officer and asked, "What are you doing opening this truck?" The officer looked uneasy and replied, "This truck might have evidence from a burglary, and I'm searching for that evidence. Besides, what right do you have to question my duties? I need to see some identification. You're not supposed to be here without an escort." Just then, an older officer walked over to Steve and said, "Mr. Jensen, I'm having trouble finding the key for this truck. It's not in the key rack like it should be." The officer in front of Steve looked concerned and paled visibly when Steve said, "Do you think the key might not be where it should be because this officer has it in his hand without permission?" The officer started to back away but was blocked by the older officer and Steve. The impound officer said, "Patrolman, do you have the key to this truck? If you do, please hand it over. This gentleman has permission from the court to take a recorder that is believed to be in this vehicle." The officer slowly handed the key to Steve and began to walk away. Before he vanished from sight, the impound officer spotted him and asked to see his ID. With some hesitation, the officer handed it over and then quickly left. Steve discovered the tape recorder and felt relieved to find the tape was still inside and in good shape. He didn't listen to the entire tape, but what he heard matched what Jeff had told him. Before leaving the impound lot, he thanked the officer and learned who had tried to access the truck without permission. When court resumed, the judge called the attorneys to the front. He asked, "Did you find out the information we needed during the break?" The prosecutor replied, "Yes, Your Honor. Here is a copy of the restraining order. It was filed right after 4 p.m. yesterday. Clearly, Mr. Fielding broke this order when he was at his old home." The judge examined the order before turning back to the prosecutor, speaking in a sarcastic tone. "Isn't it curious how an order can be filed at 4:20 in one office and then served less than 30 minutes later across town? It seems the officer who delivered the order was the first to stop Mr. Fielding's truck. Mr. Fielding was never formally informed of this order. Isn't it strange to accuse him of breaking an order he never saw, especially since it was filed after he started taking his things from his home?" The prosecutor looked troubled and speechless after the judge's remarks. The judge turned to Steve and said, "I hope you have better proof for your case than the prosecutor does." Steve replied, "I believe so, Your Honor. However, I lack some important evidence. I'm actually lucky to have any evidence at all." He explained what he found at the police station's property room, and then how he reached the impound yard just as the officer was trying to unlock the truck. The judge became angry upon realizing the officer had accessed the key without permission. "Your Honor, I haven't listened to all of the tape, but I do know it's working. Would you like to listen together?" With the judge's nod, he pressed play. The courtroom was silent as the tape played on. As time went by, Howard and Amy looked increasingly upset. They stood to leave, and Howard shot a glare at Jeff as they walked out. Once the tape ended, the judge paused for a moment before banging his gavel. "Case dismissed. Mr. Fielding and Mr. Fielding, you are free to go. I trust you won't break the restraining order now that you are aware of it." Jeff and Joe followed Steve out of the courtroom. Their first stop was the property room. Then they went to the impound yard to get their truck for the 2-hour drive home. Steve followed them to the cabin and shared a drink while they talked about the day's events. Joe went home and Jeff and Steve continued their conversation. Jeff said, "Mr. Jensen, I don't know how my grandfather can help, but I want to see that guy pay for what he did. I want his name ruined and his business shut down if possible. And I want my wife, who betrayed me, to face the consequences too. Can we do that legally, or do I need to look for other options?" "Hold on a second," Steve replied. "First, call me Steve. Second, I don't want you to rush into anything. We just got you out of one tough spot. Take a breath and let your grandfather and me figure this out for a bit. I'm not sure what he's planning, but knowing your grandfather, he's going to make a big impact. He said he would talk to you in a couple of days about it. So just wait and see, okay?" Jeff didn't have any important tasks at work, so he decided to take a few days off to relax and organize his things in the cabin. He turned the second bedroom into an office and displayed his personal items in the other rooms. He switched out some of the furniture with his own, but left most of the resort's furniture for use. Jeff saw Abigail several times each day and began to get to know her. She still brought him coffee in the mornings and either made his breakfast in the cabin or brought him leftovers from the lodge. Several times Jeff told her she didn't have to do that, but she would laugh and say, "I've never met a man who could cook better than me, and my dad always said breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Your grandmother asked me to take care of you, and that's what I'm going to do." Unless Abigail was busy, she joined Jeff for breakfast, and he started to enjoy her company. One evening he was sitting on the deck watching the sunset and sipping a drink when Abby came down the path from the main lodge. She was clearly heading for the swimming hole, carrying a towel and cooler and wearing a modest swimsuit. When Abigail saw Jeff, she stopped to chat with him. They talked for a few minutes, and Abby finally climbed up on the deck to sit with Jeff. After a little more conversation, she said, "If I want to swim before it gets dark, I need to go. I'll see you in the morning." As she started to leave, she turned back and said, "Hey, why don't you come with me to swim for a bit? It's way too hot for you to just sit there with your drink. You need to let some of it out." Jeff didn't agree, even when Abigail asked him nicely. Finally, she went back to the deck and sat next to him. She leaned over, opened her cooler, and took out a black cherry drink. They sat quietly for a moment, and then Jeff turned to her and asked, "I thought you were going to swim. Why are you sitting here?" Abby looked at him and replied, "I don't want to swim alone, and I know it's not good to drink alone either. Since you won't go with me to the swimming spot, I guess I'll just sit here and relax as we enjoy the evening." Jeff watched her for a minute and said, "All right, if you're going to feel that way, I'll go with you. Let me get my swimwear." Abby smiled as she saw him walk a bit unsteadily into the cabin. She thought she heard him stumble while getting ready, but she didn't check. After they cooled off in the water, Jeff climbed out and lay back on one of the beach towels they had brought. Abby followed him. They were lying there talking and watching the sunset when Jeff asked, "Abby, I know this isn't my business, but why are you here? I've heard you say your parents moved away and left you. Why didn't you go with them? And why aren't you in college? You seem really smart, but you're working this job for our company." Abby's eyes filled with tears, and she turned to Jeff and said, "Mr. Fielding, it's not your business why my parents moved and I stayed. If you can't drop it, you can find someone else to swim with. Just so you know, I am going to college. I take 1 or 2 classes each semester and I do well. I want to take more classes, but I can only afford so much right now. I have 27 credit hours completed. It may take time, but I will earn my degree. I'm studying hotel and restaurant management to manage a place like this. Now, can we change the topic, or should I leave?" After she said this, Abby stood up and started to gather her things. Jeff quickly got up too and took her arms gently. He looked into her eyes and said, "Abby, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. I just wanted to understand more about you. If you don't want to talk about it, we won't. But if you need help, I'd be happy to assist." When he held her arms, Abigail tensed and tried to pull away. But when she couldn't get away, she stood tall and stared at him. Jeff remained firm, and finally, Abby sighed and relaxed. She said, "Okay, Jeff. I'm sorry I overreacted, but I don't like discussing that. I love this place and couldn't bear to leave it. My parents owned it but could never make a good living from it. When your grandfather asked Dad if he wanted to sell, he quickly agreed, and they headed to Kansas City to find their fortune. I didn't want to go, and since I was over 18, I didn't have to. It's tough making my way on my own, but I plan to stay here for as long as I can. Your grandfather lets me have a small room in the lodge as part of my pay. I can eat at the lodge too, so I manage. Sometimes I get really frustrated with Dad for leaving all of this behind." Jeff wrapped his arms around Abby to comfort her. She rested her head against him, feeling safe. He noticed her tears on his chest. Jeff sighed. It felt nice to hold someone close again. His thoughts wandered to how Abby was just the right height for cuddling. Then he gently kissed the top of her head. "Abby, I understand completely. I plan to return to Steelville after college. I was deeply in love with my wife before I graduated, and we intended to marry after getting our degrees. Before the wedding, we talked about where to live, and Amy firmly said no to moving back here. She said it was either her or Steelville, and I chose her. I did convince her to live in Springville so I could visit often, but she mostly refused to come back here. For some reason, she really dislikes small towns and rural areas. I wish I had chosen Steelville instead. I feel at peace every time I drive down the road towards home in this resort. If I marry again, I won't choose someone who won't live here with me. This place is part of me. It's where I belong, and it's where I want to raise any children I might have. Abby looked up at Jeff and smiled. She wiped her eyes and quickly kissed him on the lips. Oh, Jeff, I think you love this place just as much as I do. If anyone had to buy it, I'm glad it was your grandfather. At least it is back in your family, and it's clear your family loves it. Jeff looked at Abby and held her hands. Yeah, maybe I do. I've never felt anywhere else like I do here. I've never met anyone who understands my family's feelings about this place until you. Abby smiled and said, Thank you, Jeff. That's sweet. But I should get back to my room. I have some work to finish, and it's getting late. You'll be down for breakfast unless you'd rather come to the lodge? No, please come down. I think I'd enjoy having breakfast with you here more than at the lodge. It feels more relaxed when we eat on the deck. After Abby left, Jeff sat back down on the deck because it was still early to go to bed, and he didn't want to watch TV. Many nights he would read a book or browse the internet, but tonight, those activities didn't interest him at all. Instead, he listened to the cheerful sound of the stream flowing by the yard and over the stones. He thought about how different Amy and Abigail were. He could never imagine Amy here, but he often pictured Abby curled up beside him, enjoying these peaceful evenings by the stream. He leaned back in his chair, watched the stars, and felt the tension leave his body. The next morning, Jeff woke up to laughter and the warm sun on his face. He felt stiff and desperately needed to use the bathroom. In his confusion, he took a moment to remember where he was. He had fallen asleep in his chair on the deck and hadn't noticed the whole night. Abby stood in the doorway, watching him try to wake up, and she laughed out loud. Between her giggles, she managed to say, What's wrong, sleepyhead? Couldn't make it to your own bed? I knew I should have taken care of you last night. By the time she finished teasing him, Abby stood with a playful grin, her hands on her hips. She stepped back to let Jeff through the door, and he shot her a playful glare as he passed by. He needed to hurry to the bathroom, feeling a little uncomfortable. He heard Abby giggling again as the sound of the running water followed him back to the kitchen. When Abby turned to give Jeff a cup of coffee, she was surprised by his serious face. Setting the cup down quickly, she felt a moment of fear as he approached her, but then she burst into laughter when he started tickling her. She squirmed and wriggled, trying to escape his playful poke until he finally stopped. Jeff looked down at her and said, Let that be a lesson. It's not nice to tease your elders. Abby stood there trying to be upset, but she just couldn't manage to keep a serious face. Usually cheerful, her sunny personality was trying to shine through again. Jeff watched her struggle to hold back a smile. He seemed thoughtful, then leaned in closer. Their lips met, and as he gently opened his mouth, Abby slowly let her tongue touch his. She sighed and leaned against him as they shared the moment. When they finally pulled away, Abby turned away, her cheeks flushed. Jeff stared at her, noticing they were both breathing a bit faster. He reached out and gently turned her to face him again. She covered her face with her hands, and he gently took her wrists to move them aside so he could see her eyes. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Then Jeff stepped closer to Abby, leaning against the cabinet and guiding her gently until she was positioned between him and the counter. He placed his hands on the edge of the counter, one on each side of her, and leaned down for a quick, gentle kiss. Abby kissed him back, and when Jeff pulled away, she turned and picked up the coffee cup again. She handed it to him, saying, Here, drink your coffee and behave. Do you want your breakfast now, or should we have some coffee first? Jeff reached past her to pour another cup and handed it to her. He took her hand and led her outside to the deck. They sat together, watching the sun rise and the warm light filtering through the trees around them. They enjoyed the peaceful sounds of cattle lowing in a nearby stream. They relaxed, taking in the beauty of the morning mist over the fields. Finally, Abby stood up and started toward the kitchen. Before leaving, she said, I need to get your breakfast and get to work. Your grandfather will be upset if I don't. Jeff followed her into the kitchen and stood behind her, lightly resting against her as she worked at the stove. He nuzzled her neck gently, smiling when he heard her surprise and saw her shiver. He placed a soft kiss there, then pulled back and said, "Oh, I would never let him get rid of you. You know he values you. He said you could run this place on your own and he couldn't find anyone else like you. Besides, what would I do for company if you left?" Abby felt warmth in her stomach at his words. She wondered what was happening to her. She reminded herself that Jeff was married and couldn't possibly be interested in her. But why did he keep getting close to her? She smiled and returned to preparing their meal, enjoying his company. She had never felt quite like this around any other man. It was comforting, and she appreciated every moment he spent with her. Not long after Abby left the room, Jeff's grandfather entered the cabin and made his way to Jeff's office. Jeff had been trying to focus on his work and was frustrated with himself for letting personal issues distract him. He hadn't heard his grandfather enter the cabin and jumped when he spoke. His grandfather said, "Jeff, if you have a moment, I'd like to talk about what you told me regarding Harriman Printing and what we've learned about Howard and his friends." Jeff felt uneasy when he heard his grandfather say that. He took a deep breath and replied, "I really don't want to deal with that situation, but I guess we need to handle it." Jim sat in a large leather chair in the corner of the room. He leaned back and rested his feet on a footstool before he began to speak. "I finally heard from Homer. He has identified almost all the men Amy has been involved with since he started watching her and Howard. There are a couple he doesn't have full names for, but we know the companies they work for, and we'll get the names soon. Most of the men Amy has been with are married, and many have children. We have addresses for everyone we know, and a lot of their personal information. Now it's time to decide how to approach them. That is mainly what I want to discuss with you. How tough do you want to be on the men involved with Amy? When this happened to me, I took a very harsh approach, but looking back, I'm not sure it was the best choice." Jeff took a moment to collect his thoughts. Jim noticed his face turned red with anger, and his breathing became heavy. Jim could see Jeff working to control his feelings before he finally spoke. "I want to make things difficult for Howard and Amy. I want to ensure all the unmarried men lose their jobs, and for the married ones, I want them to face serious consequences, especially those who knew Amy was married. I want to make sure their wives know everything we find out so they can make their own choices. I believe they should all face the music. I suggest we share our information with the authorities and those above them. If we can show they gave Harriman larger orders or paid more than others for the same documents, they might get into trouble with the law or company rules." Jeff's grandfather smiled at him after he finished. He said, "We are completely on the same page. If we handle this correctly, we might even be able to add a printing unit to our business. From what you've discovered and what Homer has found, I believe we can put enough pressure on Howard that he will have to either sell the company or go bankrupt. In either case, we could acquire it for a very low price. With that in mind, I've come up with a preliminary plan. It has a good chance of success, but it might take several months to complete." Jeff returned the smile and said, "Time isn't an issue for me. In fact, the longer we take, the more Howard will struggle. If we do this wisely, we can maximize his troubles and benefit ourselves. All I care about is making sure Howard and his friends know that I am the one causing them trouble. I want them to feel my effects and understand that I am in charge." Jim smiled and said, "I have no issue with that, but you should be careful. I have more experience in these situations, and I want to help you put the plan into action. We also need to keep Steve informed so he can help us stay within the law." The two men talked for a little longer. Then Jim left to have lunch at home. Jeff thought about making a sandwich but decided to go to the lodge instead. When he walked into the small dining room, it was just about the end of lunch. Abby looked up from her cleaning, surprised by the footsteps. A big smile spread across her face when she saw Jeff, and her heart skipped a beat. Abby didn't remember moving, but soon she was standing next to Jeff's table. Without thinking, she asked, "I didn't expect to see you here. Do you want some lunch?" Realizing what she had said, Abby blushed and bit her lower lip. Jeff smiled and replied, I thought about making a sandwich at the cabin, but I remembered how great you are at cooking and decided to come here and let you make me something. Maybe we can have lunch together if you have time." Abby beamed and said, "Of course. I haven't eaten yet. Why don't we go outside? It's so nice out today, and I've been wanting to find a reason to go out." While they ate, Jeff kept glancing at Abby. Finally, she set her glass down after taking a sip and asked, "What?" Jeff seemed surprised and said, "Huh? What's wrong? Why do you keep looking at me like that? At first you seem so calm and happy, then your eyes go blank and you seem far away. Have I done something? Is something wrong?" "I'm sorry, Abby. My grandfather and I have started planning against the men who took my wife from me. I've been thinking about our next steps and what I need to do to get things moving. A lot of the work will be up to Grandpa because he knows some of the people we need to cooperate with. Even with his help, I still have a lot to do if we want to succeed. I don't like thinking about how busy he'll be because that means less time for our chats, fishing, and swimming. But I am looking forward to finally getting some justice." The next Monday, Amy entered Howard's office and sat down at her desk. She felt worn out from her weekend business trip and the ongoing divorce issues. She was close to giving up on trying to talk to Jeffrey. Each time she reached him on the phone, he hung up, and often he wouldn't answer if he saw her number. Amy was surprised when she realized a few weeks ago that she didn't really miss Jeffrey. Of course, all her personal needs were being met when she was working on deals for Howard. She remembered how she had influenced Jeff for so long and felt that if she could just get him to communicate with her, he would offer her more in the divorce settlement. She was grateful he hadn't caused her more difficulty than he had. Perhaps he was the weak person Howard said he was. Maybe he was worried about making too much noise because he feared facing those he considered better, as Howard had mentioned. When they were dating and engaged, Amy thought she truly loved Jeffrey. Now she questioned if that was true. She liked him a lot, and they had a great time in college, which made her believe she loved him. However, she hadn't stopped her adventurous outings even while they were together. She had reluctantly given them up after becoming engaged to him and missed them terribly until Janet helped her become an assistant. Being with Jeff was enjoyable, but there was something more thrilling about the exciting connections she sought with other, more influential men. In truth, she found the thrill of possibly getting caught exciting too. Deep down, Amy acknowledged her true feelings. Ultimately, she wanted the savings she and Jeff had managed to collect during their marriage. Well, the money and the companionship she was now experiencing. Amy hadn't even gotten fully settled into her daily routine when Howard called her on the intercom. "Amy, could you come in here, please? I need to talk to you about some matters." Amy smiled and told her assistant Sally that she would be in Howard's office and to hold all calls. Sally looked at her and said, "Yeah, I bet he needs to talk. He's probably feeling tense after a weekend without company. I don't think his wife spends enough time with him." Amy walked toward Howard's door with confidence. Just before she opened it, she looked back at Sally and said, "Oh, I don't think he'll need any help this time. After all, there's only one person in there." Her excitement was evident by the time she stepped behind Howard's closed door. As Amy began to unbutton her blouse, she turned to Howard, surprised when he said, "Don't do that. We have some important matters to focus on this morning. Do you know a Jim Fielding or a Paul or Edward Fielding?" Amy sat down and looked at Howard. He appeared stressed and unwell. She responded, "Yes. Jim Fielding is Jeffrey's grandfather, Paul is his father, and Edward is his uncle. Why do you ask?" "I was playing golf this weekend with Stuart Roshowitz, and he told me that the order we are processing for them right now will be the last one we receive. I asked him why, and he told me it was because he had to choose between working with us or with Jim Fielding and his companies. This morning, right after I arrived at the office, I got a call from Rollins Manufacturing. They were canceling their order and told me not to reach out to them again. When I asked David Rollins why he was canceling, he said, "I was fishing this weekend with Paul and Edward Fielding and learned some things I didn't like about your business. I have seen DVDs of you and your assistant speaking with my purchasing manager, and I don't like your approach. I have let my purchasing manager and his assistant go for giving you the contract. I understand the authorities are looking into their actions this week." Amy, I also received 2 faxes canceling orders this morning. I contacted Joe Randall about one of them and asked why he was canceling. He responded, Howard, I know better than to cross the Fieldings and Steelville Feed and Farm Supply. I don't know what you did to upset them, but you should fix things quickly or your business could be in trouble. They are very serious about this. They told me that if I continued working with you, I wouldn't be able to work with them. They are a major part of my sales and own a good portion of my business. I asked why he was so worried about a small-town farm store. He laughed and said, "Either you don't understand or you don't see how important they are. Steelville Feed and Farm is like Missouri's version of Berkshire Hathaway, and Jim Fielding is their version of Warren Buffett. I wouldn't want to interfere with them." Amy felt a wave of fear. She lowered her head as Howard shared the troubles surrounding them. When she looked up at him, he had a tense expression and a pale face. He raised his voice, almost shouting, "Why didn't you tell me that your husband had this much influence?" I started to wonder when he managed to stop our first plan against him, and I was curious when he didn't react to our other attempts after he returned to that town. Now I see why. It was like I was bothering someone much bigger than me. "Amy, I think you should find another job. I can't keep you here much longer. If you hadn't put us in this situation, we wouldn't be dealing with this. Now please leave." Howard turned his attention to the papers on his desk. Amy stood up, tears in her eyes, and said, "Howard, I'm sorry, I just didn't know. They seem to live like they're just getting by. They don't have big parties or take fancy trips. It seems like they are always saving money. They live in that small town in those little houses. If they have money, why don't they show it?" Howard sighed and looked at Amy. He asked, "Do you know who Warren Buffett is?" Amy nodded, and he continued, "He still lives in the same house he bought long ago, and he is the richest man in the world. Did you ever check how much Jeff and his family are worth, or did you just think they were poor because they lived in the country?" Amy felt a heavy weight in her heart when she realized Howard was right. She had thought that since Jeff and his family were from the countryside, they didn't have much money. When she learned about the store, she thought they were just doing okay in their small town of Steelville. Now it hit her that she had given up something valuable in her search for excitement and connections in big city life. If she had focused on Jeff and played things wisely, she might have already had what she wanted. Why had she forced that prenuptial agreement? Tears filled Amy's eyes as she turned to leave Howard's office. Just as she reached for the door, Howard said, "Before you go, send in my new administrative assistant." As Amy stepped out, Sally hurried to her side and wrapped her arm around her. "What's wrong, Amy?" she asked. Amy replied, "Jeff and his family are causing problems for Howard. He fired me this morning. I didn't know Jeff was so wealthy. Howard asked me to send in his new assistant right before I left. Sally, I know this life seems exciting, but if you want to keep your husband, you should quit and stay away from Howard. I'm not sure what's happening, but if Jeff and his family are causing trouble, you could get caught up in it too. I just hope it's not too late for you." That day, Amy felt miserable. All she could do was sit at home and cry, wondering how things had gone so wrong. All she ever wanted was an exciting life full of glamour in the big city. Growing up in a small town in Indiana, she promised herself she wouldn't get stuck in one again. Her whole life had been about making more money and meeting important people, trying to rise above the dullness of small-town life. Now, just when she thought she had it all within reach, Jeff and his family had disrupted her plans. Amy felt angry as she thought about Jeff. How could he stand in the way of her dreams? She realized she had made a big mistake when she married him, but at the time, he seemed like a great choice. He was a teaching assistant at Wharton School of Business, after all. He graduated with top honors. He could have had any job he wanted and could have lived in any big city, or at least earned enough for them to vacation there. How was she to know about the part of him that wanted a simpler life? Amy was feeling sorry for herself when her phone rang. She let it go to voicemail at first, but picked it up when she heard her mother's voice. However, when her mother started to speak, Amy wished she hadn't. "Amy, how could you?" her mother said. "You had a wonderful husband and you messed it all up. You know your father and I aren't strict. We know about certain things because I caught you and your brother watching movies like that when you were younger. But honestly, I have never seen some things like what you did. We heard rumors in college, but we never imagined you'd go this far. How could you hurt such a good husband?" Amy tried to respond, but she heard her mother hang up. She dropped the phone and began to cry. That night, her phone kept ringing, but she didn't answer. Most of the messages on her voicemail were from friends and family who had received a copy of the DVD. One message stood out. It was from a man she had once met. He was angry and said, "You messed everything up for me. I lost my job and my wife is leaving me because of you. If I see you again, you better watch out. You tell your boss I'm coming after him too." The next few weeks were hard for Amy. She had no job, and even with unemployment benefits, her money was running out too fast. She cut back on everything she could. She had a lot of debt on her credit cards and began making only the minimum payments. She canceled her cable and all her memberships, but she was still losing money. She sent out over 200 job applications and had 3 interviews, but no new job came through. Even worse, the job she interviewed for offered only half of what she used to earn. One job interview got canceled when the HR manager found out she was connected to the situation that got their purchasing manager fired. He wasn't very polite when he told her. He simply said, "Miss Fielding, this company doesn't work the way you seem to. We wanted nothing to do with someone who thought it was okay to use their relationships to get ahead in business. I had to let go of a close friend because of the way you and your boss did things. We don't want anyone in our company who conducts business like that." Amy was heartbroken and cried all day, but there was little she could do. The day of her divorce hearing finally came. Amy didn't want to go, but her lawyer convinced her it was best. During the hearing, she caught herself watching Jeff. He looked handsome sitting there with his lawyer, and somehow he seemed more important and in charge than before. She wondered why she hadn't noticed that earlier. Despite her lawyer's efforts, they could not break the prenuptial agreement. The judge looked at her sharply when Jeff's lawyer presented a letter stating that she wouldn't marry him unless he signed the prenuptial agreement as she wanted. Who would have thought they would hold on to something like that? Finally, she leaned towards her lawyer and told him to stop fighting. She said to tell the judge she would accept the divorce and settlement as Jeff outlined. By that time, she just wanted it all to be over. She realized she had made her own mess and had to deal with it. Since the house was no longer hers, Amy spent the week packing and searching for a new place to live. She felt lucky to have hidden the bonus money Howard gave her. She had saved over $200,000 before losing her job, but it was disappearing fast. If she was careful, she could get by for a little over 3 years. If she could invest it and earn some interest, it would last longer, but she was nervous about doing that. What if the IRS found out she hadn't reported it? Amy was still upset that her parents wouldn't let her move back home. Living in her small hometown seemed better than losing all her savings. Her father went as far as to say they didn't want anything to do with her after everything that happened. Amy thought about staying with her sister in her college apartment, but her sister hadn't agreed to that yet. She worried their father would stop paying rent if he knew Amy was living there. On Monday evening, after her divorce was finalized, Amy sat at her desk looking for jobs online. She was ready to give up for the night when the doorbell rang. She got up and looked out the window. Sally stood at the door, crying and looking very sad. Amy hurried to the door and opened it just as Sally was stepping off the porch. Amy asked, "Sally, what's wrong?" Sally paused and looked at Amy. She replied, "Oh, Amy, you were right. I made one last sales call with Howard, and then I told him I was going to quit. I explained that I was scared to keep working because of what was happening with your husband and his family. I told him that the extra money and the work were not worth risking my marriage. He got angry and said that I couldn't leave because he needed my help to rebuild the business." Amy, I didn't return to work the next day, but it was too late. I received divorce papers for being unfaithful. I did get to talk to Darren before he left, and he told me that Jeffrey was the one who informed him. At least we didn't have a prenuptial agreement like you did, so I will get some of our shared assets. Oh, Amy, what am I going to do? I love Darren so much. I regret letting you influence my choices. You made it seem so thrilling, and the money would have helped. I had some truly wonderful experiences, but I always felt guilty about what we did. I'm relieved it's over, but now I've lost Darren. How could I have been so foolish? Amy invited Sally to stay the night. After they finished dinner, Amy called Janet to come over. The 3 women poured some wine and talked about their problems. They managed to resolve one issue. They all had some of the money Howard gave them as bonuses saved up. Janet had kept her house and some assets after her divorce. She offered to let Sally and Amy move in with her and share the costs. Since Janet had given her child up for adoption, it would only be the three of them. She made it clear that they would have to split all the bills evenly, including the house payment. But Janet would keep ownership of the house. Their share would be considered rent. Janet was the only one of the women who worked. She had left her job at Harriman Printing and found a low-paying job elsewhere before all the rumors started. Her boss had questioned her about Howard and her work for him. She explained she had gotten divorced because of a mistake and had left the company. She had no information about what happened there after she left. He frowned and said, "You've done a good job here. Just don't do anything that would get this company in trouble, and we will be fine." The three women stayed connected with friends, still working for Howard. They heard that Howard's business was in serious trouble. His wife had divorced him and took most of their investments and the house as her share. As Jim and Jeff dealt with the companies that had affected Amy, they made sure to keep things in check. Most of the men lost their jobs, and the company stopped working with Howard. Many of the wives divorced their husbands and took everything. Howard thought he had secured new contracts several times, but they fell through when it was time to finalize them. Whenever he reached out to company representatives, about 8 out of 10 told him they didn't want to go against Steelville Feed and Farm Supply. Howard's anger toward that company and the Fielding family grew stronger. He blamed them for his failures and developed a deep dislike for them. Howard had to let go of 3/4 of his staff. Now he only had a dozen printers, 4 salespeople, and 2 secretaries left. Some months he didn't print enough to cover his expenses. He sold his country club membership and was cutting personal costs, just like Amy and her friends. One Monday morning, just before lunch, Howard received a call that would signal the end of his company. His banker told him he had a week to catch up on his loan payments, or the bank would start making moves toward bankruptcy. The banker explained he was giving Howard a warning since they had been friends, and he had been a good customer. They would send the official notice later that day. Howard didn't take a lunch break. Instead, he started searching for other funding but couldn't find any. Due to falling sales and gossip about his financial troubles, most bankers wouldn't even talk to him. Those who did were unwilling to help once they learned how serious his situation was. By the end of that week, Howard felt completely defeated. On the Monday morning, the week after speaking to his banker, an attorney visited Howard in his office. The lawyer informed him that the bank would file the foreclosure papers that day and would place him into bankruptcy. Howard sat silently, unable to respond as the attorney finished speaking and left. With his head in his hands, Howard felt anger boil inside him. He couldn't believe how quickly someone could bring him down. In the past, when he made a request, people usually jumped to help him. Many husbands had even known about their wives' affairs but ignored it due to Howard's threats. Howard opened the top drawer of his desk and glanced inside before reaching for the item resting there. It would be so easy. No. Before that, he knew he had to deal with Jeffy and his family first. Howard locked his office and left the building behind him. As his business continued to struggle one afternoon, he received a call from a business broker. They got straight to the point. They were in touch with a company that learned Howard's business was struggling. That company might want to buy his printing business if the price was fair. Would he consider selling? At first, Howard thought about saying no, but then he decided to hear the offer. He was pleasantly surprised by how generous it was. Without looking at the details, it seemed they would pay off all his debts, and he would still have around $250,000 in cash if he sold to them. They made it clear that he needed to sign the contract right away and agree to never compete in the printing business again. Howard asked them to send the contract so he could read it first and then decide. In celebration of the good news, he treated himself to a nice meal, similar to the ones he used to have when entertaining customers and suppliers. Back then, he didn't worry about spending a lot on meals. Suppliers often paid for their meals, and if they didn't, Howard claimed the expense as a business cost. The contract arrived the next day by registered mail. Howard made another mistake. The contract seemed simple, and he trusted the man on the phone, so he didn't have a lawyer look it over. The law firm that had worked with him before refused to continue serving him after his troubles began. They told him they didn't want to work with him anymore, so he hadn't found a new lawyer and didn't want to take the time to search now because the buyer had given him a tight deadline. Howard read the contract and smiled as he signed it. He thought he could use the leftover money after paying his debts to start fresh in a new business. He believed that with the right assistant, he could succeed again quickly. He should have paid more attention to the fine print, especially the part that promised to cover his debts up to the sale price of the business, with any extra money coming to him in a certified check. The day of the deal arrived, bright and sunny. Howard felt hopeful. Maybe it was a sign. The closing would take place at the bank he used. Before they signed the lien release and withdrew the bankruptcy filing, they needed to receive their share of the purchase price to settle Howard's loans. The bank would then sign the lien release before he got his check for the remaining amount. Howard was excited as he walked into the bank, feeling that things were finally getting better. He was starting to recover from the difficult times the Fieldings had caused him. Now, he just needed to find another business to run and plan how to address the Fieldings after he got his check. As Howard entered the meeting room, he noticed the back door closed behind him. There were 5 men sitting around the table. One was Howard's banker, one was a court officer, and one was the bank's lawyer. The other 2 were from the purchasing company. One was a lawyer, and the other was the chairman of the board. Howard thought he recognized the lawyer but could not recall from where. Everything felt very formal. Howard signed the papers where needed and smiled. The banker and the lawyers examined the documents. Howard's banker pointed out that the vice president of operations for Steelville Feed and Farm Supply had not signed 1 page. Howard felt frustrated and asked, "What do you mean by that? What does that store have to do with this deal?" The banker replied, "They are the ones who bought your business, Howard." Howard was confused. "Oh no, they didn't. I agreed to sell to Western Missouri Printing. What's happening here?" The familiar lawyer smiled and said, "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding. You did sell to Western Missouri Printing, but they are owned by Steelville Feed and Farm Supply. So, Mr. Jeffrey Fielding, the vice president, needs to sign as well. Don't worry, he just stepped out for a moment. I will call him back in so he can sign, and we can finish this deal." While the banker was calling Jeff, Howard said, "This is not right. The deal is off. I'm not letting that store take my business." He reached for the documents, but the bank's lawyer picked them up first. "Howard, I'm sorry, but you've already signed these papers. That means they are a valid contract unless the buyer decides not to sign. The only way to stop this deal is by both sides agreeing, or if one side fails to sign." Just then, Jeff walked back into the room. "I'm sorry I missed the signing. I needed a quick break. Here, let me sign and we can complete this business." After the final signature, the lawyers checked the files again and handed out copies to everyone involved. The checks that were already prepared were given to the banker for Harriman Printing, and everyone began to put their documents into their briefcases. After the bank received their check, and the officer of the court got the paperwork to withdraw the bankruptcy petition, Howard sat and waited. He was so upset that it was hard to remain calm, but he wanted to wait until he got his money. He was shocked as he watched the other men continue to gather their papers and put them away. Finally, Howard spoke up. "Excuse me, gentlemen, but aren't you forgetting something?" The chairman of Western Missouri Printing looked around the room and said, "No, I don't think we are. Is there anything we missed, Steve? Or do you, Mr. Fielding?" The lawyer shook his head and kept packing his bag. At this point, Howard was feeling angry. He raised his voice. "You haven't paid me yet. I was supposed to get about $250,000 in addition to having the loans taken care of if I did my math right." "Oh," the chairman replied. "I completely forgot about the paperwork for that amount. Let me check. Yes, here it is. The remaining balance is $247,563. 79. Howard's smile returned when he heard this, but it faded when the chairman continued, "Here's the receipt for the distribution. I'm really sorry we didn't give that to you earlier." Howard jumped up yelling, "Distribution? What do you mean by that? That money was meant for me." The attorney said, "I apologize for the misunderstanding. You're correct. That was your money. But you must remember the lion on your assets if you sell the business. Your divorce agreement stated that you had to pay your ex-wife a share of the sale price if you sold during her lifetime. Unfortunately, after expenses, what you have left doesn't quite meet that amount. You'll probably hear from her and her lawyer soon to arrange payment." Just as Howard was about to leave, Jeff walked back into the room. Howard froze and felt his face heat up in anger. "You again? What are you doing here?" Jeff smiled and said, "Glad you're still here, Howie. I forgot to mention that I have some people here to take you back to your old office to collect your things. Sorry for the mix-up." Howard stood there feeling shocked. He was so angry he could barely move. He was baffled that this person was vice president of operations for the company that had just put him in a tough spot. He glared at Jeff and mumbled, "You're unbelievable," before storming out. In the hallway, he was met by a guard in uniform. The patch on his shoulder read 4 State Security Service, part of Steelville Feed and Farm Supply. The guard asked, "Mr. Harriman?" After Howard nodded, the guard continued, "I'm here to take you to your old office so you can collect any personal items before you leave the building. Shall we go?" Feeling defeated, Howard nodded. He started walking, and the guard followed him. When they reached the garage, the guard got into Howard's car with him. He said, "I'll ride with you to help you get back inside. My team will follow in our van." As Howard entered the building, he noticed another guard by the door. His receptionist didn't even look at him while he was led to his old office. He walked through the door and came to a sudden stop. Jeffrey Fielding was sitting in a guest chair talking to a well-dressed woman behind his desk. Howard felt his face heat up and exclaimed, "What are you doing in my office? Please leave!" Jeffrey glanced at Howard and responded, "First of all, Howie, this is no longer your office. I own this company now, and I can sit wherever I want. I was having a discussion with Mrs. Hartshorn, the president of our printing division, about our ongoing operations while we wait for the new plant manager. It's really none of your business." Jeff turned to Mrs. Hartshorn and said, "Maybe we should take a break while Mr. Harriman clears out this office. We've talked about everything we needed to for today." A few days later, Howard was on his patio cleaning his gun when one of his few remaining friends walked up. He watched Howard for a moment and said, "Howard, I've heard you've been spending a lot of time at the shooting range. I saw you this morning. Hitting the target 7 out of 10 times is good, but it's not enough. If you're thinking about getting revenge, you should reconsider." Howard looked at his friend and replied, "I don't know what you mean, Jack. I don't have much to do now that my company is gone, so I've taken up target practice. Is that wrong?" Jack responded, "It's fine if that's all you're doing. But if you're considering getting back at the Fieldings, you should know a few things. Jim Fielding is a retired Army officer. Paul Fielding is a retired colonel, and Jeffrey Fielding has military experience too and is still in the reserves. Most of their family has served, and many of their employees have as well. Even if you manage to confront 1 or 2 of them, it could end badly for you. I really think you should drop it and start fresh somewhere else." Howard sat in shock as his friend's words sank in. He sighed and said, "Yeah, sounds like a plan." The next day, Howard packed his few belongings and headed for the Pacific Northwest. He arrived in Portland, Oregon, with all his possessions in his car and strong feelings of anger towards the Fielding family. He sat in a budget hotel bar, reading through the job ads when another guest sat next to him. The unassuming man glanced at the job listings Howard had circled and said, "Looks like it's tough to find work. I've been searching for 3 weeks myself. What happened to you? Did the housing crisis affect you? Or was it the banking issues?" Feeling chatty that afternoon, Howard shared a simplified version of his story. He concluded with, "In short, I had everything I wanted. I had a wife who took care of our home and a business that made me a lot of money. Every couple of years, I would get involved with someone else for fun. My customers enjoyed the thrill of being with married women, but I made a big mistake. I got involved with the wrong woman, and her ex-husband and his family went after me. They had more power, and I couldn't stand against them. My wife divorced me and took most of what I had, except for the business. Then those Fieldings managed to take over my business and merge it with theirs. The lawyers told me there was nothing I could do because everything was done legally. Now here I am, starting over at 56 with almost nothing." His new friend looked at him and shook his head. He said, "That's tough. Looks like we're both in a similar situation. My wife caught me cheating, and she took everything from me too. Well, see you later." After the divorce, Jeffrey went back to Steelville to restart his work. The only bright spots in his life were Abigail and his success against Howard. He had won, but it felt more like a loss. He wasn't sorry to leave Springville, but he missed Amy a lot, even after everything that happened. No, it wasn't exactly her he missed. He missed the relationship he thought he had with her. He knew he would never get back with her, but he longed for the companionship they once shared. Jeff was at his desk when Abigail came in. She noticed his sad posture and the lost look in his eyes, and she felt a wave of sympathy for him. She didn't know what was bothering either of them. She had never let anyone get this close to her and didn't understand why she allowed it to happen this time. Abby also couldn't understand why Jeff hadn't moved on. It had been a year since his troubles began. He was divorced, and he had dealt with the man responsible for it, while his rivals had merged with a strong company. She heard that the Harriman printing division was already doing well. They had even brought back all the workers Mr. Harriman had let go, except for his close team. Abby knew she wasn't supposed to know about Steelville Feed and Farm Supplies business, but while she cleaned and cooked for Jeff, sometimes she saw his computer on or important papers left open on his desk. She was surprised to discover how big his company really was when she started helping him. She had no idea how wealthy the Fieldings were either. Without thinking, Abby walked over and put her hands on Jeff's shoulders. She leaned down a little and said, "Jeff, you've been staring at that screen for 5 minutes. It's after 6 p.m. Why don't you just take a break? We could go for a nice swim if you hurry. After that, I can make you dinner if you want." Jeff turned to Abby and smiled. "That sounds like a great idea. I can't focus anyway, so let's go." Abby laughed and quickly took off her shirt and shorts, revealing a bright red swimsuit. "I'm ready. What's taking you so long?" she asked playfully. She giggled and dashed out of the room just as Jeff reached for her. "Last one in has to clean up after dinner," she shouted while running toward the swimming hole. Jeff chuckled and sprinted after her, not bothering to change since he was only in shorts and a shirt. By the time he reached the edge of the water, Abby was about to dive in. They both jumped into the water at nearly the same moment. When they surfaced, Abby shouted, "I won! I won!" Of course, Jeff said he won too. Eventually they agreed it was a tie, but neither wanted to take the punishment of cleaning the kitchen. Finally, Jeff swam over to Abby, dove under the water and sprang up, playfully lifting her as he surfaced. Abby giggled as she was pushed through the water and splashed down with a laugh. When she came up for air, Jeff was floating nearby. He swam closer, and Abby turned to stand in shallower water watching him. Jeff stood in front of Abby and noticed she seemed cautious. After a moment, he said, "How about a truce? Since it was a tie, I should take you out to a cafe for dinner. That way we both avoid kitchen duty. Sound good?" Abby looked surprised for a moment and then replied, "I guess we could do that. But why do you want to pay for dinner? I usually cook for you." After they came out of the water, Jeff paused and looked into Abby's eyes. "Abby, your job is to take care of the resort and cook for the guests. You do so much for me, more than you need to. I just want to show my appreciation and thought it would be nice to share a meal together where we can talk. Actually, why don't you go change into something nice, and we can drive to Springville and eat at Red Lobster?" Abby's eyes widened, and she gasped, "Oh, I couldn't. It's so far, and it must cost a lot." Then she saw a sad expression on his face, which changed her mind. "Oh, Jeff, when my parents were here, that was my favorite place, but we could only go for special occasions because it was so expensive. Thank you. If you really want to, I would love to go with you." Jeff smiled and playfully tapped her on the back as she headed for her room. Abby squealed and turned to give him a playful look, then headed inside. He looked a bit unusual. She finally said, "Now stop that, or I'll have to scold you." Then she turned and hurried to her rooms to change. Jeff was waiting in the lobby when Abby came out of her cozy suite. She was wearing a short sundress and sandals. Her eyes sparkled, and her hair was tied back in a ponytail. She walked with a lively step that seemed to say, "Look at me. I feel great and I'm happy to be here." Jeff smiled when he saw her and felt a rush of warmth. She was so lovely and seemed unaware of it, unlike many beautiful women. Amy had always been eye-catching and expected attention from men. There was a special energy in Abigail. She worked hard and was always cheerful and ready to help. She acted like she didn't even notice how beautiful she was, which made her company so refreshing. Abby was the kind of person who didn't need to fill every moment with chatter. She was fine with silence when she didn't have much to say. Jeff enjoyed her calming presence and appreciated how easy it was to be with her. Amy would talk non-stop or turn up the radio if he didn't keep the conversation going. With Abby, he could simply relax and enjoy her company without distraction. After they finished their meal, they returned to the lodge. The journey took them a little over 4 hours. Jeff parked his truck in his usual spot, and before he could get around it, Abby stepped out and walked up to him. She looked him in the eyes and said, "Thank you for the meal. It's been over 3 years since I enjoyed dining at Red Lobster, and I loved every moment." As Abby started to head toward the lodge and her rooms, Jeff touched her arm gently. "Abby," he said, "it's just a little after 10 p.m. Why don't you come to my cabin? We could sit on the deck and enjoy a glass or two of port. Grandma Ann always says that's the best way to end a perfect evening, and I agree with her." Abby looked into Jeff's eyes and said, "I'd like to spend more time with you, if you don't have anything else planned. But what is port? I've never tried it before." Jeff replied, "Oh, I think you'll enjoy it. It's a sweet dessert wine made from grapes and brandy. The one I have is made with red wine, but some are made with white. Both types are quite strong. The red port goes really well with chocolate." Once they were seated, Abby took a small sip of her port and coughed. "Wow," she said. "That's strong, but I think I like it." They talked and talked. Jeff kept their glasses filled, and Abby started to feel a little lightheaded. She glanced at the clock and exclaimed, "Oh no, it's midnight. I have to go. I need to work in the morning. Thank you so much for this lovely evening. It has been so special." Jeff got up when Abby did. He walked her back to the lodge. When she started to go inside, he reached out and touched her elbow. She stopped and turned to him. Her eyes widened when Jeff leaned in and gave her a soft kiss on the lips. "Thank you for tonight," he said. "I have really missed evenings like this. I just love to sit and talk with someone as nice as you. Thank you for a wonderful time." Jeff turned and walked away before Abby could say anything. She watched him walk back to his cabin and go inside before she went to her room for the night. The lodge telephone woke Abby from a deep sleep. She hurried to the office to answer it. A rough male voice spoke on the other end. "This is Major Simons from the Army Personnel Command. I need to speak to Captain Jeffrey Fielding, please." Abby felt a shock. She knew Jeff had been in the Army and was still in the reserves. She was worried about the call but knew she had to find him. She told the major he was in his cabin and she would connect the call. About 45 minutes later, Abby was getting ready to bring Jeff his morning coffee when she saw him come out of his cabin with a big dark green bag over his shoulder. He was in his uniform and looked sharp. She ran over and asked, "Jeff, what's going on? What did that major want?" Then she covered her mouth and said, "Oh, I'm sorry if you can't say. Why are you in your uniform? I thought your meeting was not until 2 weekends from now." Jeff looked at Abby after he tossed his bag into his truck. "Abby, I've been called up for a short tour. They said I would probably be gone for 6 to 12 months. It's a job that needs to be done quickly. I don't even have time to say goodbye to my family. I'll call them from the road. Could you please let them know what happened if you see them before I can call?" Fear washed over Abby when she heard that. A tear started to roll down her cheek when he bent down and gave her another gentle kiss like the night before. "Goodbye, beautiful," he said. Then he jumped in his truck and drove away. Abby stood there with tears on her cheeks when Ann drove up. She jumped out of her car and ran to Abby. "Hey girl, why the tears? Why are you standing here crying?" Abby looked at Ann and whispered, "He's gone. They called him and said he had to go do a mission right away and he might be gone for a year." When Abby said that, Ann looked where Jeff usually parked his truck and understood. She wrapped her arms around Abby and asked, "You love my grandson, don't you, honey? Did he leave and now you feel scared?" Abby hugged Ann tightly and cried on her shoulder while nodding yes. Ann comforted her and said, "Sweetheart, what you're going through is one of the hardest things we face. We have to stand by and watch our loved ones go off to danger. The toughest part is waiting and hoping they come back safe. We pray every day that they come home, not in a way we fear. Now let's move forward and focus on what we can control." Abby looked up at Ann and said, "He called me sweetie. He wanted me to tell you he needed to get there fast and would call when he could." About 2 weeks after Jeff left, Abby woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of the phone ringing. She dashed to the lodge office and answered just as it stopped. Abby? A voice said. Abby, it's Jeff. Is that you? Jeff! Oh yes, it's me, she exclaimed. Where are you? Are you okay? Jeff laughed and interrupted her, saying, Sweetheart, I'm fine. I found a moment to call you because I've missed hearing your voice. Are you doing okay? Yes, I'm fine. But where are you now? I'm in the mountains, but I can't say more. I'm running out of time and have to go. Take care, sweetheart. Then there was silence. Abby tossed and turned the rest of the night. Jeff had called her. Days went by, winter arrived, and Christmas was nearing. Abby felt sad this Christmas more than in years. Her dad offered to send her money for a ticket home, but she didn't want to leave. Christmas was on a Thursday that year. The Monday before Christmas, a UPS truck came to the lodge. The driver brought in a large box. Abby couldn't recall ordering anything, but saw it was addressed to the resort. When she noticed the box, she felt thrilled. It was from Jeff. Unsure what to do, she decided to call his parents to let them know about the big box at the lodge. She got Jennifer on the line and told her about it. Jennifer, Jeff's mom, said, Since it's addressed to the resort, you should open it, dear. Nervously, Abby opened the box to find many smaller boxes inside, each labeled with different names and wishing Merry Christmas. Jeff had sent gifts. Abby was overjoyed to find one with her name on it, thankful she had also sent Jeff a little present. Excitedly, Abby called Jennifer back. Oh, Jennifer, I opened the box as you suggested and it's filled with smaller boxes. There's a Christmas present for everyone in the whole family. There's even one for me. Jennifer laughed and said, Well then, why don't you put them under the tree, and we can all open them on Christmas Day? Abigail was invited to Jeffrey's grandparents' home for Christmas dinner. She felt a bit out of place since it was a family gathering, but they insisted she come, so she agreed. Everyone got together early in the morning to open gifts and enjoy the holiday. Even Charlie, Jeff's brother, came all the way from Seattle to be with the family. His wife, Charlene, was serving in Afghanistan with the army. Some of the children were old enough to read the names on the gifts, so they passed them out. Abby smiled at the cheerful atmosphere. She was surprised when she received a gift from all the adult couples, plus one from Jeff. She felt overwhelmed and said, Oh, you shouldn't have done this. I didn't get anyone a gift. I didn't know I would be invited here. Anne interrupted. Abby, we didn't want you to spend your money on gifts for us. We all have what we need, except for Jeff's and Charlene's safe return, and we know you need that money for college. So don't worry about it. Abby noticed everyone taking turns opening their gifts. She decided to wait and choose which gift to open first. She arranged the gifts by size, saving Jeff's for last. Her second-to-last gift was from Jim and Anne. When she opened it, she found an envelope, thinking it might be a small bonus for her work. To her surprise, it was a letter from her college saying her entire next semester was paid for in full. She could attend college full-time for at least one semester or part-time for 2 semesters. It was fantastic news. Abby was in tears as she ran to Anne and then Jim, hugging them both. Oh, thank you so much. With this, I'll be able to work towards my associate degree. I'll finally be halfway to my bachelor's. Thank you. Jim chuckled as she settled back down. The whole family watched her eagerly. Abby noticed she was the only one with an unopened gift left. With tears in her eyes, she picked up the present from Jeff and carefully unwrapped it. She gasped in disbelief. He had sent her a beautiful gold chain with a pendant covered in clear stones. They couldn't be real diamonds, could they? No way would he spend that much money for a Christmas gift for her. Anne noticed her staring at the box. Abby? What's wrong, dear? Abigail reached into the box, pulled out the chain, and slowly put it around her neck, tears of joy streaming down her face. All the women gathered around her, admiring her beautiful necklace. They wanted to try it on and take a closer look. When it was Anne's turn, she examined it carefully and said to Abby, This is stunning, Abby. That pendant must be worth several carats. We should find you a dress that matches this necklace perfectly. After that moment, Abby couldn't focus on anything else. She kept looking at her college statement and the necklace, tears flowing down her cheeks. It was the best Christmas she had ever experienced, and she felt nothing could top this day. When January arrived, the cold weather settled in. Sometimes Abby received letters from Jeff. Most of them seemed to come to her, along with 2 emails each week. She felt happy that he remembered her, but also guilty that he was writing to her instead of his family. In February, the news reported a serious conflict in Afghanistan. A Green Beret team had attacked a Taliban stronghold in the mountains. Instead of the expected 30 or 40 Taliban fighters, there were more than 300. Many Green Berets were hurt. The team leader took great risks to help his injured men. The fighting was intense, and he had to call for air support very close to his own position. Abby was shocked when she asked Paul, Jeff's father, what danger close meant. He seemed lost in thought as he explained, "Abby, danger close is when you request air support so close to your own troops that there is a chance of friendly fire. It's only done when it's absolutely necessary. If the enemy is about to overrun your position, you have to take that risk." Later that evening, after Paul explained the situation to Abby, he returned to the lodge. Abby had locked the doors and was studying in her suite when she heard the door open. She peeked out and saw Paul coming towards her. He looked very troubled, making her heart sink. "Abby, please come with me. Jennifer and Anne want you to come to Dad's for a little while." Abby felt tears welling up in her eyes. "No, please, it can't be Jeff." Paul looked at her and gently said, "He was injured, but they believe he will be okay. Unfortunately, some of his teammates weren't as fortunate. It was his team we heard about on the news." Overcome with emotion, Abby cried harder and ran into Paul's arms. She had no idea how he guided her to his car and into Jim's house. When they arrived, another soldier was there, speaking with Jim and Edward. He stood up when he saw Paul and said, "Colonel, I've been updating your family on Captain Fielding's condition while we waited for you. Is this the young lady we've been expecting?" Paul nodded and replied, "Yes, Major. This is Abigail. I believe you mentioned you had transportation arranged for tomorrow morning?" "Yes, sir. Some of our team will be in Germany for a while, but Captain Fielding and the others with less serious injuries will be arriving in the States in a day or two. We have your rooms ready and will meet his plane when it arrives." "Thank you. Would you like to stay here tonight or at my house? We can also get you a room at the lodge if you prefer." "Oh, no, sir, but thank you. I can go back to town. I already have a room there. I will be here at 8 a.m. tomorrow to help with the arrangements." "That's not necessary. Abby, can you help the Major settle into a room at the lodge tonight?" Abby nodded and said, "Of course, sir, and I'll make sure he has breakfast in the morning, too." Major Davis drove Abby back to the lodge after the family visit. He was kind about answering her questions, leaving her feeling a bit better than when she first learned about Jeff's injury. The next morning, everything was hectic. Jim and Anne decided to stay at home to manage the resort and other business, while Paul, Jennifer, and Abigail flew to Washington, D.C. to wait for Jeffrey's arrival at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. He had specifically asked for Abigail to be there, and his parents would not let her stay behind. Eventually, she agreed to go with them. When the morning papers were delivered, many in the towns around Steelville were shocked. The heroic Green Beret team's battle from the day before was in the news, and many were surprised when they learned the names of those brave soldiers. One name stood out to many readers: Jeffrey Fielding. Many knew him or had heard of him. Some even called him a friend. Two people who read the papers had slightly different reactions. Amy was taken aback by what she read about Jeffrey, and initially felt sad. She regretted missing the chance to feel proud of knowing such a notable person. How could she have misunderstood Jeffrey's character and potential? The other person reading the article sat in a low-cost diner, struggling to eat a not-so-great breakfast before heading to his sales job at a hardware store. He looked closely at a picture of a Green Beret captain on a stretcher, greeted by his family at the airport, covered in bandages with his leg in a cast. Howard angrily tossed the newspaper across the booth, where it slid to the floor, exclaiming loudly, "That guy! He is luckier than anyone else. Not even the Taliban can harm him." Howard felt uneasy and pushed his breakfast away. He gazed out at the gloomy February morning and sighed. He realized it was good that he listened to his friend and didn't seek revenge on the Fieldings. Howard got up and headed off to his unfulfilling job and the rest of his dull life. At the same time Howard and Amy were reading about his close call and brave actions, Jeffrey was watching a door open in his hospital room. He still felt weak and was in a lot of pain, but a big smile spread across his face when Abigail walked in, followed by his parents. Abby walked over to his bed and gently placed her hand on his bandaged chest. Tears glimmered in her eyes. Jeff reached out, wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her close. He beamed up at her. Just then, the doctor entered the room looking at a chart. Noticing the crowd, he frowned. Visiting hours had not started, and he wondered why they were all there. He was about to ask when the head nurse walked in with a coffee pot. She said, "Colonel, I thought it would be easier to bring the whole pot instead of individual cups. Just call the nurse's station if you need anything else." The doctor, a major, stopped speaking and stood respectfully. "Colonel, I apologize. I wasn't aware the colonel would be here this morning. How can I assist you?" Paul replied, "No need for anything from me, doctor. Just keep doing what you can for my son, and he'll be grateful. Can you share any details about his condition or how long he will be here?" "Of course, sir. Give me a moment to check on the captain, and he'll update you." The doctor listened to Jeff's heart and lungs, then asked about his pain. Jeff answered, "I am in a lot of pain, sir, but at least I'm still here. I suppose that makes me luckier than many of my men." The doctor said. "Aside from your injuries, you're doing quite well. We need to get you up and moving a bit. He'll send for physical therapy shortly. For now, try to walk to the nurse's station and back a few times today. Let's see how that goes." The doctor nodded to Paul and then motioned towards the door. Paul stepped out, followed by Jennifer. Abby looked at Jeff, then glanced at the door. Finally, she released his embrace and walked to the doctor and his parents. The doctor addressed them, saying, "Colonel, he is out of danger. We have him on antibiotics to prevent infection. It has been long enough that if there were any problems with his intestines, they would know by now. From what I can see, all that needs to happen is for him to heal and get back to his usual self. I estimate he will be here for another week or so, and then he can take some time off to recover. I believe it will take about 6 months before he feels completely back to normal." Abby was tearful as she listened to the doctor. She asked, "But he will be all right? He won't have anything wrong for good?" The doctor looked at her and then turned to Paul. When Paul nodded, the doctor replied, "Miss Stover, he will be fine. He will have some scars, stiffness, and pain for a while, but most of that should go away over time. I don't think his injuries will end his career, if that's what you are worried about." Abby gazed at the doctor and said, "No, I just wanted to know if he will be okay." Paul looked at Abby and then the doctor. He stated, "Doctor, you should talk openly about my son's condition and treatment with this young lady. She has the right to know everything you would share with him or us. Is that clear? Please make a note of it in his records." When Paul spoke, the doctor straightened up. His face turned red, and he clenched his teeth in frustration. He looked at Paul, then Abby, and said, "Yes, sir. Is there anything else, sir?" When Paul shook his head, the doctor walked down the hallway. Paul turned to Abby and said, "Abby, I think Jennifer and I will head downstairs for some coffee. Would you like to join us, or?" Abby smiled and replied, "No, sir. I think I'll just go back in and see Jeff, if that's all right with you." She turned and walked back into Jeff's room. When he saw her, he smiled and held out his arm for her to come closer. Abby pulled up a chair next to his bed and leaned into it while Jeff wrapped his arm around her shoulders. She leaned in and gave him a gentle kiss, feeling him relax, and let out a sigh. After a moment, Jeff started to shift himself toward the edge of the bed, away from Abby. She pulled back and asked, "Jeff, be careful. What are you trying to do?" Jeff smiled and patted the bed next to him. She looked at him with some concern, then slowly stood up. As she looked down at him, he softly said, "Abby, please, just for a little while. When I was lying there, unsure if I would make it back, all I could think about was wanting to hold you. Please, just for a little while. I promise I won't do anything you don't want." Abby hesitantly sat on the edge of the bed, took off her shoes, and carefully lay on her side next to Jeff, facing him. His arm went under her neck, and she felt him pull her gently closer. He turned and gave her a soft kiss. They lay there, looking into each other's eyes. Suddenly, Abby heard a rough female voice say, "What on earth?" Then she heard laughter from both a man and another woman. She almost fell out of bed as she turned to face the people who had interrupted them. Her face turned red, and she gasped in shock when she saw the head nurse and Jeffrey's parents standing in the doorway watching her. Abby stammered, "He said he just wanted to hold me." Jennifer walked over to Abby and gently put her fingers on Abby's lips. "Shh. It's okay. We didn't expect this. Just relax," she said. Abby felt her tension ease and sat back down beside Jeff's bed. She reached out and held his hand, amazed that he had slept through it all. He looked much more relaxed now. Paul and Jennifer stayed for 2 more days before deciding to head home. They arranged for Abby to stay and take Jeff home once he was ready for his recovery leave. If everything went well, that would be in 2 or 3 days. She would take him back to Steelville. The day before they were set to leave, Jeff was given a pass to go outside. He insisted that Abby join him for lunch at a restaurant followed by a short walk before returning to the hospital. While they looked at the menu, Jeff seemed lost in thought, and Abby began to worry. After they ordered, Jeff called the waiter over for a quiet chat. The waiter stepped back, saying, "Take your time, sir." Jeff leaned across the table and said to Abby, "I need to use the restroom. Can you give me a moment? If you need anything, Jock can help. I might be a few minutes, but don't worry." Abby felt uneasy but smiled at him bravely and nodded. It felt like he had been gone forever. She checked her watch. Had it really only been 15 minutes? Then she looked again. It was 20, then 30. She started to worry more. What if he had fallen? What should she do? Finally, Abby saw Jeff coming back. He was walking carefully but had a cheerful bounce in his step, which was impressive on crutches. He was grinning widely. As he got closer, he attempted to kneel but winced and said, "Oh no, I guess I should sit after all." When he swayed a bit, Abby reached out to help him steady himself. He pulled out a chair from the next table and faced Abby, looking into her eyes. The waiter and restaurant manager stood nearby, holding a bottle of sparkling drink, while other diners watched. Jeff reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a small box. He opened it, looked inside, and then turned it toward Abby. He licked his lips and started to speak. "Abby, I had already fallen in love with you before I was called back to active duty. I waited for the right moment to ask you something, but it never seemed to happen. During my time in Afghanistan, I could not stop thinking about you. In every spare moment, I remembered your smile, your laughter, and the happiness you brought. I felt so complete and peaceful when I was with you. But when the situation grew dangerous, and I thought I might never see or touch you again, I felt like part of me was dying. Abby, I don't want to spend a single moment of my life without you. Will you marry me?" As Jeff spoke, Abby grew more anxious. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she took hold of Jeff's hand. She replied, "Oh, Jeff, I love you too, but what about your family? I mean, what would they think? I have so little to offer. I'm just the cook and housekeeper at your resort. You can't marry me." Jeff felt a deep ache in his stomach. He held Abby's hands and gazed into her eyes. He said, "Abby, they know how much you mean to me. They care about you just as much. Don't you see how they've welcomed you into the family? My mother brought this ring when she came with you. It belonged to my grandmother, and she thought—" Jeff smiled and continued, "She told me that whenever I decide to marry again, she wanted the special lady to wear this ring. Do you really think she would have brought it if they didn't like you?" Abby smiled through her tears as she reached for the ring. With a gentle motion, she placed it on her finger. "Yes, Jeffrey Fielding. Yes, I will marry you, and we will raise our children in Steelville at the resort." When the other diners, the waiter and the maitre d' saw her putting on the ring, they all applauded, and a bottle of champagne was brought to their table. The maitre d' leaned down slightly and said, "May I be the first to congratulate you, Captain and Madam?" He turned to Jeff and added, "That gentleman," pointing to the door where some well-dressed men were leaving, "has kindly informed me that lunch and the champagne are taken care of. He heard about your bravery and wanted to show his gratitude." Jeff looked toward the door and waved, asking the maitre d', "Who was he? I need to thank him." The maitre d' smiled and said, "He told me that if you asked, I should not say. He mentioned he would see you again to thank you properly for your service." After their enjoyable lunch, Jeff and Abby walked arm in arm to the cab that would take them back to his room at the hospital. Jeff nearly had to persuade Abby to leave his room and return to her hotel, but eventually she agreed. The next morning, Jeff's car picked her up from the hotel, and they both headed to the airport to return home. Abby was surprised when they walked out of the arrival area at the airport. If she didn't know better, Abby would think the whole town of Steelville was there to greet Jeff. They cheered and pushed, reaching out to shake his hand. Abby felt her anger rise when some of the unmarried women tried to get close to him. She stood between them and Jeff whenever she could, placing her hand on his arm and looking up at him. He smiled down at her. Suddenly, Abby felt a pull on her hand, and it was Darlene from the cafe. "Jeff, Abby, is this what I think it is?" Darlene asked as she held up their joined hands. Jeff smiled, and Abby blushed but nodded. Darlene laughed and called out, "Everyone, look at this." She raised Abby's hand high, showing off the engagement ring. This excitement led to more handshakes and pats on the back for Jeff, along with hugs and kisses for Abby. Soon the crowd was gently guided down the concourse and out to the sidewalk, where they began to head toward their cars. It was a long drive back to Steelville. When they reached town, it was decorated like the 4th of July. Banners, streamers, flags, and yellow ribbons were everywhere. Those who hadn't met them at the airport waved and welcomed them as they drove through the streets. Jeff's parents took them to the VFW hall, where there was a big welcome home dinner and party for Jeff. It was after 11 p.m. when they finally made it back to the resort. Abby helped Jeff out of his parents' car and into his cabin. She guided him into his bedroom and stood on her tiptoes to give him a gentle kiss. She sighed and leaned into him when he wrapped his arms around her. As they kissed, their affection grew. Abby felt their closeness deepen as they enjoyed the moment together. She felt both excited and happy to be with him. Abby savored each kiss, feeling their connection grow stronger. With a smile, Jeff pulled her even closer. Abby felt a thrill as she leaned against him, enjoying their time together. She was lost in the moment, feeling safe and content in his company. They both smiled, feeling comfortable as they lay down together, sharing warmth and affection. Abby and Jeff shared a tender moment, gazing into each other's eyes and holding each other close. Abby sighed as Jeff gently ran his hand over her back, and she softly held on to him, feeling a mix of warmth and closeness. Abby felt a bit nervous as she looked up at Jeff, realizing just how much this moment meant to both of them. Sensing her hesitation, Jeff gave her a reassuring smile and asked, "Are you okay?" She nodded, though her voice was a bit unsteady. "It's just, everything feels so new to me," she admitted, her words quiet and heartfelt. Jeff was a little surprised and took her hand in his, understanding her more deeply. "I didn't realize this was your first time in such a close moment," he said, his voice soft. "I'm so sorry. I should have been more gentle. I wish I could be more careful with this cast on my arm, too." Abby gave a small laugh through her nerves, wiping her eyes. "It's okay. I know we'll figure it out together." She held onto his hand tightly, finding comfort in his presence. Jeff met her gaze with a thoughtful look. "You know, it might feel uncomfortable at first, but we can take it slow. And if at any point you want to stop, just tell me," he said with warmth and care. But Abby shook her head with determination. "No, I'm ready. I want to be here with you," she insisted, drawing strength from her feelings. As they held each other close, Abby shifted carefully, settling into a comfortable embrace with Jeff. They moved slowly, taking their time and feeling the moment together. There was a gentle silence between them as they both adjusted, making sure the other felt okay. In that quiet time, they shared their emotions, feeling close, trusting each other with a new sense of understanding. Every touch and every glance conveyed the tenderness they both felt without needing any words to say it. In the warmth of the moment, they found a quiet joy together. It was a peaceful and lasting connection, filled with care and respect, a memory they both would hold dear. She leaned against Jeff, feeling him kiss her. The last thing Abby remembered that night was sighing and rolling off Jeff to fall beside him. When she woke up, sunlight was filling the room and someone was calling from the living area. "Jeff, are you awake? Is Abby with you? We want you to join us for breakfast at the lodge." Abby heard footsteps coming down the hallway, and then Jennifer walked into the room. Abby gasped, and Jennifer quickly covered her mouth. "Oh, Abby, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." Jennifer turned and hurried out of the room. Jeff was lying there laughing. Abby shot him a playful glare and grabbed his robe. She put it on while running down the hallway after Jennifer. Wait! I was awake and getting up. You don't need to leave. I'm sorry. He'll get breakfast ready in no time. Jennifer paused and looked at Abby. She smiled, approached her, and wrapped her arms around her. Shh, dear. I wasn't coming to find out why you didn't feed us. We have the meal ready. I just wanted you both to eat with us. But I see you have other things on your mind. I can go. Abby smiled and held on to Jennifer. No, please stay. Really, we were getting up. Abby's cheeks flushed as she added, I don't think I could do much this morning anyway. Jeff walked slowly into the room wearing only his underwear. He looked at his mother and fiancé, then grinned. Well, now that you've got me up and promised me food, where is it? Abby smiled and turned to Jeff. They cooked at the lodge. Come on, let's get dressed so we can eat with them. I'm really hungry. She turned to Jennifer and said, We'll be right there. Abby never returned to her small suite at the lodge. She gradually moved all her things to Jeff's cabin. They had set the date for the wedding, and her parents had promised to come. Abby felt so happy, but then they received another call from Washington. Abby was outside when she heard the phone ring. By the time she entered the cabin, Jeff was already on the phone. All she could hear was him saying, Yes, sir. The 19th? Yes, sir. Mill Air? Yes, sir. 19 if possible. Sir, I don't know. I was supposed to get married on the 23rd. What? Yes, sir. Abby stood there, trembling as she listened to Jeff. Her heart felt heavy, and her stomach hurt. Were they going to take him away again? Jeff finished the call and turned to Abby. He opened his arms and she rushed into them. He could sense her shaking. He stroked her hair and whispered, It's okay, dear. They just want us to go to D.C. for a couple of days. We were going to get married here anyway. Can we decorate, make the trip, and still have the ceremony then? They promised to bring us back in time. Abby slowly calmed down and looked up at Jeff. She nodded her head in agreement. Yes, that shouldn't be a problem. But what were they talking about? Why a military plane, and why did you say 19 seats if possible? Jeff smiled at Abby and said, Because that's how many seats I told them we needed for the family on the trip. I have to go to D.C. The president is going to give me the Medal of Honor, and I need to be there. Of course, the whole family will want to go too. I mentioned 19 seats just in case your parents want to join. Do you think they will? Abby gasped and took a step back from Jeff. Oh my, yes, I'm sure they will. I need to call them right now. I love you. She quickly jumped toward Jeff, gave him a quick kiss, and hurried out of the room to find her phone. Jeff and his family left for D.C. the night before the ceremony. They enjoyed great service at the hotel. The next morning, they were guided from the lobby to a bus that would take them to the White House. When they arrived, they were quickly shown to their seating area, the family in a special section, and Jeff near the podium. When the time came, a uniformed Army general approached the podium and announced, Attention, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. Everyone stood and watched as the President entered the room. He walked over to Jeff, followed by the general who held some documents. The President stopped in front of Jeff, who saluted and stood at attention. The general glanced at the papers and Jeff heard some rustling behind him. He turned a bit in surprise when he noticed Abigail. The general handed her something and said, Attention to orders. Captain Jeffrey Fielding has met all requirements for promotion to the next rank and is hereby promoted to Major United States Army Reserve, effective June 1st, 2009-A. Jeff felt Abigail adjusting his uniform as she carefully took off his captain's insignia and replaced it with his new major's insignia. Once she finished, she smiled with pride and stepped back a little. The general looked at his papers again and stated, Attention to orders. Department of the Army, June 17, 2009. By the direction of Congress, the Medal of Honor is awarded to Major Jeffrey Fielding for showing bravery and courage at great personal risk while on duty. While leading a Special Forces team during a challenging mission against superior Taliban forces, Captain Fielding put himself in danger to direct the mission and bring seriously injured team members to safety. Captain Fielding was hit many times by gunfire and shrapnel, yet he continued to lead his men bravely. He directed the battle so wisely that his team of 13 men defeated an enemy force of about 300. Sometimes the enemy pressed hard on his unit, and he even called for support fire on his own positions. Because of his actions, Captain Fielding proved himself and accomplished much more than anyone expected. He was gravely injured, and only the continuous care of the medic saved his life. While the general read the award citation, the president placed a ribbon around Jeffrey's neck. After the ceremony, Jeffrey extended his arm to a smiling but teary-eyed Abigail. They walked off the stage and headed to the room for a reception. As Jeffrey and Abigail greeted guests, the president approached them with a smile. "Congratulations again, Major," he said, shaking Jeff's hand. He then turned to Abigail and said, "And this lovely lady must be the future Mrs. Fielding. I must say we were all hoping for you at the restaurant that day. Did you enjoy the meal and the drinks?" Abby gasped and asked, "You were the one who paid for our lunch." She watched the president nod and continued, "Oh, thank you so much. We didn't know. The manager only said a kind gentleman had paid. Thank you." The next morning, Jeffrey and his family enjoyed a late brunch while the rest of the country carried on with their usual activities. In a rundown factory lunchroom in Springville, a sad Amy read the morning paper. She pulled the paper in front of her and gasped. Her friend Jolene peeked over her shoulder and saw the photo of Jeffrey and Abigail together while the president awarded him the Medal of Honor. "Isn't he handsome?" Jolene said. "I read that article while having breakfast. They say the woman with him is his fiancée. He has been divorced for 3 years. I bet his ex is regretting losing him. With looks like that and a medal, too, he could have anyone." Jolene noticed Amy sniffling and asked, "Hey, what's wrong?" Amy cried harder, and Jolene pulled her into a comforting hug. Once Amy calmed down, Jolene pushed her back gently and said, "Okay, tell me what's going on." Amy sniffled again and said, "I'm the one who lost him. He was my ex. I thought he was a loser and tried to improve myself without thinking about how he would feel. Now this just proves I was wrong. It turns out he and his family have money too. He had told me, but I just didn't understand him and I messed up." The small town of Steelville was buzzing with excitement. Never before had one of its own received such honor. A local man was named a national hero, and he was going to marry a girl from town. Everyone wanted to attend the wedding and celebrate with them, but the family resort was too small for all the guests. Finally, they reached a solution. Jeffrey and Abigail had a small wedding with just family and a few friends. Afterward, everyone moved to the local school gym for the reception. By the time all the guests had congratulated the happy couple, it was late. The dancing and fun continued for hours. The newlyweds slipped away around 2 a.m., but rumors said the celebration continued without them until almost 5 a.m. There was only one shadow over the wedding day. A messenger brought an envelope from Amy to Jeffrey during the reception. Inside was a small card that read, "How could you? You hid your fortune from me, yet took everything we had when all I wanted was to make our lives better. Now you enjoy fame and luxury while I struggle in a dead-end job and a tiny apartment." After reading the card, Jeff crumpled it up and tossed it away. He walked outside into the night and picked up a bottle of scotch from a nearby bar. Abigail, noticing what he had done, retrieved the card from the trash. Tears streamed down her face as she read it, then she hurried after Jeff, finding him sitting in a swing, drinking. Abby rushed to Jeff, wrapped her arms around him, and kissed him passionately. She whispered, "Honey, just forget about it. We both know she's not worth your time. You have me now, and I will never do anything to hurt you. We're a team. We will work together, live together, love together, and grow old together. I love you so much, and I can't stand her either." They shared a moment of comfort, and then he allowed her to guide him back inside. Although he seemed quiet for the rest of the evening, Abby stayed close to him, making sure he was cared for. The next day, Jeff walked into their cabin and heard Abby talking on the phone. She finished the conversation and smiled brightly when she saw him, skipping over for a kiss. Jeff held her tightly, feeling grateful to have Abby in his life. A week later, Jeff informed Abby that he needed to go to Springville for a meeting. He asked if she would like to join him for dinner before they returned home. Abby smiled back and happily agreed. They chatted as they drove and shared a sweet kiss before Jeff got out of the car for his meeting. Abby planned to shop while he worked and then pick him up afterward. Jeff's meeting started at 11 a.m. and went through lunch until 4:30 p.m. He found himself waiting in the building lobby for over 30 minutes when Abby finally arrived. He rushed to the car and jumped into the passenger seat, wanting to kiss her. Instead, he froze in surprise. Her hair looked messy, and there was a red mark on her cheek. Her face had some scratches, and her knuckles were scraped. Abby looked at Jeff with fear in her eyes when she saw his reaction. He asked, "Honey, what happened? Are you okay?" Abby bit her lips and nodded. She looked at him and said, "I had a flat tire and bumped my head while fixing it. She paused and started to cry. Then she said, "No, I just can't." "I promised." She leaned back in the seat and took a deep breath. "Honey, I promised not to lie to you, and it's only been 3 weeks of marriage and I started to. I'm sorry. I will never do that again. I found your ex, and we had a talk about that note she sent you. I think she gets it now that she needs to leave you alone and move on." After she spoke, Abby glanced nervously at Jeff. Her eyes looked haunted. Jeff pulled back in his seat, surprised, and then suddenly burst out laughing. He laughed hard until tears filled his eyes and finally said, "Oh my God, I can't believe you confronted Amy over me. What will I do with you?" Abby looked at him, a shy smile forming on her face. "Keep me close and love me, please." Jeff laughed again, sliding closer to her in the car. He pulled her in for a kiss. Afterward, he gazed into her eyes and whispered, "I can do that. Do you want to eat somewhere or go home?" Abby smiled and replied, "Well, you did promise me a meal." She started the car and drove to Jeff's favorite restaurant, a French bistro. She grabbed a large shopping bag and followed him inside. At the door, she whispered in his ear, "I need to freshen up. Go ahead, and I'll catch up with you soon." Jeff waited at their table for several minutes, starting to worry when he saw Abby walk in. She looked beautiful. She had washed her face, fixed her hair, and wore a lovely red dress. Every eye in the room watched her as she walked gracefully to Jeff's table. He could only sit and watch in admiration. Jeff was surprised when Abby didn't order her usual drink, but mentioned that one of them should stay sober to drive home. Just before dessert, Abby leaned closer to Jeff and said, "Honey, I have something important to tell you too. You remember the night we came home from the hospital and you taught me how to—" "Oh, honey, I'm sorry, but I didn't take care of myself. I had no idea this would happen. Oh, Jeff, we're going to have a baby." Jeff looked at Abby, and then a big smile spread across his face. "Wow, a few months ago I wasn't sure I would ever see you again and hold you like I wanted to. Now I'm married to you. We live in the one place I've always wanted to be, and we're expecting a family. You know, honey, life doesn't get much better than this. Hey, everyone. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of the exciting stories we have coming up. What do you think about the characters in this story? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.